Welcome, friends. I'm so glad you're here. Whether you're drifting towards sleep, unwinding after a long day, or simply looking for a quiet companion, you've found the right place. Before we begin, I'd love to know where in the world are you listening from. Perhaps you're wrapped in a blanket, sitting by a softly lit window, or resting somewhere under an open sky. Wherever you are, I hope you're warm, comfortable, and ready to wander with me into the forgotten abundance of humanity's earlier cities and the civilizations that time has nearly erased. If you find peace or curiosity in these gentle stories, please consider liking the video, subscribing the channel, or sharing it with someone who might need a moment of stillness too. And to those who've already joined along, thank you. In the heart of what is now Turkey, where the Anatolian plateau stretches toward distant mountains under an endless dome of sky. The morning light touches the walls of Çatalhöyük. 9,000 years pass like a held breath, and still the archaeologists brush dust from doorways that once knew the weight of human feet. The settlement spreads across 32 acres of ancient earth, house pressed against house in an unbroken honeycomb of mud, brick and timber that seems to pulse with the memory of countless lives. No streets divide the dwellings, no roads cut through the ancient quiet. The city exists as a single, breathing organism of connected rooftops and shared walls, where privacy comes not from distance but from the gentle separation of vertical space. The wind moves across this landscape of flat roofs like water flowing over stones, carrying with it the scent of cooking fires and the soft murmur of human voices that echo across centuries. The people climb, they ascend wooden ladders that lean against exterior walls, disappearing through openings in flat rooftops that serve as doorways to entire worlds. Families enter their homes from above, descending into rooms where the walls bear the painted imprints of human hands and the geometric patterns of a visual language that remains untranslated after decades of scholarly attention. 7,000 people live this way for over a millennium, their footsteps wearing smooth the roof paths that connect one dwelling to the next, creating highways in the sky that archaeologists can still trace in the hardened mud. The settlement pulses with the rhythm of daily life that seems both utterly foreign and strangely familiar. Children play on rooftops while their parents work in the rooms below, their laughter drifting across the maze of interconnected dwellings like bird song. Women grind grain in courtyards carved from the living rock, the sound of stone against stone marking time in a way that mechanical clocks never could. Men shape obsidian blades with a precision that modern surgeons would admire, each flake of volcanic glass falling away to reveal edges sharper than steel. In the rooms below, the floors hold the bones of ancestors. The dead rest beneath the spaces where the living sleep and cook and dream and make love and raise children. Plastered skulls emerge from walls like ancient witnesses, their empty sockets filled with obsidian and shell that glimmer in the dim light filtering down from the roof openings. The boundary between life and death blurs in these buried chambers, as if the settlement itself were built upon the foundation of memory, each generation adding their layer to the growing mound of human experience. The walls speak in languages of colour and form that scholars struggle to decipher. Red ochre handprints cluster around doorways like ancient signatures, while elaborate hunting scenes stretch across interior surfaces with a vitality that seems to breathe in the flickering light of oil lamps. Leopards prowl through painted landscapes that may represent the afterlife, or the memory of a time when great cats stalked the Anatolian plains. Vultures wheel overhead in murals that could be religious art or simply the careful observation of scavengers that cleaned the bones of the dead. Scientists uncover evidence of sophisticated urban planning in this rooftop city that challenges every assumption about early civilization. The houses cluster around courtyards and open spaces, their orientations calculated to maximize airflow during the scorching summers and retain warmth during the bitter mountain winters. Storage rooms contain grain that travelled hundreds of miles from distant fields, evidence of trade networks that spanned continents when most humans still lived as nomadic hunters. Workshops reveal the delicate craft of bead-making, textile production, and metalworking that would not be mastered elsewhere for centuries to come. The copper beads gleam with a dull fire in the archaeologist's careful hands, each one hammered and shaped with techniques that seem impossibly advanced for their time. The textiles, preserved by chance in the dry earth, show patterns and weaving methods that suggest not mere survival, but aesthetic pleasure. The human impulse to make beautiful things even when beauty serves no practical purpose. The obsidian tools cut through modern paper with edges that remain sharp after 9 millennia, their volcanic glass surfaces reflecting light like dark mirrors. Yet mysteries linger in the archaeological layers like shadows at noon. The settlement shows no clear signs of social hierarchy, no palaces or temples or monuments to individual power that mark later civilizations. The houses remain remarkably uniform in size and construction, as if a quality were built into the very architecture of daily life. No single dwelling towers over its neighbours. No central building commands the settlement's heart. No obvious seat of authority emerges from the careful excavation of streets that never existed. The distribution of goods tells the same puzzling story. Rare materials and finely crafted objects appear in nearly every household, not clustered in the hands of an elite class, but scattered through the community like gifts freely given. The obsidian blades, the copper ornaments, the carefully painted pottery all suggest a society where wealth flowed like water, finding its level, settling equally across the landscape of human need. Only the wall paintings hint at complexity that words cannot capture. Leopards and vultures, geometric patterns and human figures engaged in activities that scholars can only guess at. Dancing figures interweave with abstract symbols that could represent anything from star maps to mathematical concepts to the dreams of shamans lost to time. The paintings layered over paintings, generation after generation adding their visions to walls that served as humanity's first galleries. The irony settles like dust over the excavation sites. Fine and persistent, this may have been the world's first true city, and yet it operated according to principles that urban planners are only now beginning to understand. No traffic flowed through Çatalhöyük because there were no streets to carry it, and yet goods and people moved with an efficiency that modern cities might envy. No crime festered in dark alleys because there were no alleys at all, only the open sky above and the connected community below. The city worked by climbing, by cooperation, by the simple recognition that survival required not competition but collaboration. The wind still moves across the excavated ruins, carrying with it the whispered questions that archaeologists ask in the pre-dawn hours when the work grows quiet. How did they govern themselves without obvious rulers? How did they maintain order without apparent force? How did 7,000 people live in such proximity for over 1,000 years without the social explosions that mark later urban experiments? The earth holds these answers in layers of compressed time, each season's accumulation adding to the mystery rather than solving it. 9,000 years of silence press down upon the ancient floors, and still the questions multiply like stars appearing in the darkening sky above the Anatolian plateau, where the first city dreamed itself into existence and then vanished, leaving only the memory of ladders reaching toward heaven. The volcanic glass begins its journey in the heart of sleeping mountains, where the earth bleeds obsidian in slow, cooling flows that stretch across the Anatolian landscape like frozen rivers of midnight. The stone forms in fire and emerges sharp enough to split atoms, its edges thinner than surgical steel and harder than the finest metal that humans will not discover for millennia. In quarries scattered across what will become Turkey, craftsmen knapp the volcanic glass with bone hammers and antler tines, each strike releasing flakes that catch the morning light like captured fragments of the sun. The obsidian travels. It moves along pathways worn smooth by countless feet, carried in leather pouches and woven baskets across distances that humble the imagination. From the source quarries near modern-day Çiftlik and Nenezi Dağı, the black glass flows outward like a slow tide of commerce, reaching settlements thousands of miles away, where people have never seen a volcano but know the value of an edge that will not dull. The trade routes stretch from the Mediterranean shores to the highlands of Iran, from the Caucasus Mountains to the Levantine coast, creating the world's first truly global economy. The traders walk through landscapes that shift with the seasons and the centuries. They follow river valleys that run green with spring floods, cross mountain passes where snow lingers in July, traverse plains where wild horses thunder past in herds that darken the horizon, their footsteps wear paths that will endure for thousands of years, becoming the trade routes that connect empires not yet dreamed, the highways that will carry silk and spices and ideas across continents when Çatalhöyük is nothing but a grassy mound above the Konya plain. In settlements scattered across the ancient world, the arrival of obsidian transforms daily life in ways both subtle and profound. The volcanic glass cuts cleaner than flint, holds its edge longer than copper, and can be worked into tools so fine they seem almost magical in their precision. Surgeons in early cities perform operations with obsidian scalpels that modern medicine is only now rediscovering. Hunters bring down game with arrowheads that slice through hide and bone with effortless accuracy. Artists carve details into ivory and wood that earlier tools could never achieve. The economic implications ripple outward from each transaction like stones dropped into still water. Communities that control obsidian sources grow wealthy beyond their ancestors' dreams, their settlements expanding from villages into cities as trade goods flow through their territories like tributaries feeding a great river. Other communities adapt by becoming specialists in different materials: amber from the Baltic, shells from distant seas, copper from highland mines, creating a web of interdependence that spans continents. Yet the mystery of early trade networks defies easy explanation. How did communities separated by thousands of miles establish trust with trading partners they might never meet face to face? How did they standardize weights and measures without central authorities to enforce such standards? How did they navigate routes through territories controlled by dozens of different groups, each with their own languages and customs and concepts of territorial boundaries? The archaeological evidence suggests solutions that modern economists are only beginning to appreciate. Gift economies may have preceded market economies, with obsidian changing hands through ceremonial exchanges that created social bonds stronger than commercial contracts. Trading expeditions may have been quasi-religious pilgrimages, protected by spiritual taboos that made violence against merchants unthinkable. The routes themselves may have been considered sacred pathways, neutral ground where normal territorial rules were suspended in service of the greater good. The obsidian carries more than utilitarian value as it moves along these ancient highways. Each piece becomes a messenger, bearing information about distant places and foreign customs. The craftsmen who work the volcanic glass learn techniques from traders who have seen how other communities shape stone and bone and metal. Stories travel with the trade goods tales of distant cities and strange customs and natural wonders that expand the mental maps of people who will never travel more than a few dozen miles from their birthplaces. The irony of these early trade networks lies in their sophistication despite their apparent simplicity. Without writing systems to record transactions, without standardized currencies to facilitate exchange, without governmental structures to enforce contracts, these ancient merchants created commercial networks that rival modern international trade in their complexity and reach. A piece of obsidian napped in central Turkey could end up in a grave in southern France, having changed hands a dozen times along routes that crossed linguistic barriers and cultural boundaries with apparent ease. The volcanic glass tells stories that archaeologists are still learning to read. Chemical analysis of obsidian artifacts can pinpoint their source quarries with scientific precision, revealing trade patterns that persisted for thousands of years with remarkable consistency. Some routes operated continuously for millennia, suggesting institutional knowledge passed down through generations of traders who refined their techniques over centuries of accumulated experience. Other routes appear and disappear in the archaeological record like seasonal rivers, responding to political upheavals and climate changes that shifted the balance of power across entire regions. The craftsmen who work obsidian develop techniques that seem to border on the alchemical. They learn to heat-treat the volcanic glass to alter its napping properties, to select specific types of obsidian for different tools, to predict how the stone will fracture based on subtle variations in color and texture that modern eyes struggle to perceive. Master nappers become legendary figures in their communities, their skills so valued that they enjoy status equivalent to priests or war leaders. The workshops where obsidian tools are made become centers of innovation that drive technological advancement across multiple fields. The precision required for fine stone working develops hand-eye coordination and spatial reasoning that transfers to other crafts. The understanding of fracture mechanics leads to improvements in architecture and engineering. The aesthetic sense cultivated through creating beautiful tools influences art and decoration throughout these early societies. Yet questions remain embedded in the volcanic glass like bubbles frozen in ancient lava. Why do some communities become obsidian specialists while others remain generalists? What social mechanisms prevent the obsidian trade from being monopolized by warrior elites who could easily control the routes through force? How do quality standards evolve and spread across trade networks that span thousands of miles and dozens of languages? The wind carries obsidian dust across the Anatolian plateau, where modern quarries still produce volcanic glass for collectors and craftsmen who practice ancient techniques. The stone continues its patient journey from mountain to workshop to distant settlement, following pathways worn smooth by 9 millennia of human footsteps. In archaeological museums around the world, obsidian artifacts rest in climate-controlled cases like fragments of humanity's first global conversation. Each piece a word in a language of commerce and craft that connected our ancestors across distances that seemed impossible to cross. The trade routes themselves have become archaeological features, preserved in the landscape like fossilized rivers. Satellite imagery reveals ancient pathways etched into hillsides, marked by the accumulated debris of countless caravans and the patient erosion of millions of footsteps. These ghost roads wind through modern cities and agricultural fields, invisible to casual observers but clear to those who know how to read the subtle signatures that time leaves on the earth. The obsidian continues to flow, as it has for thousands of years, carrying with it the memory of humanity's first understanding that cooperation across great distances was not just possible, but essential for the flourishing of complex civilization. The volcanic glass reflects this ancient wisdom in its dark, sharp surfaces, holding the light of distant fires and the dreams of traders who saw opportunity in every horizon. The caves open like mouths in the Patagonian cliff face, their entrances worn smooth by 10,000 years of wind that carries the scent of ice and grass across landscapes that seem to exist at the edge of the world. Deep within these caverns, where the rock walls curve away into darkness punctuated only by shafts of golden light, human hands press against stone and leave their marks for eternity. The handprints cluster across the cave walls in Cueva de las Manos like a constellation of human presence, each one a signature written in ochre and hope and the desperate need to say we were here, we existed, we mattered. The hands belong to different centuries, different generations, different worlds entirely. Some were pressed against the rock when the climate was warmer, and the rivers ran fuller through valleys that are now wind-scoured and dry. Others mark periods when ice advanced from the south, and the people retreated to these caves for warmth and shelter, and the comfort of rituals that connected them to ancestors whose own hands had touched these same walls. The continuity spans millennia, an unbroken chain of human contact with stone that makes the cave itself into a kind of temple, a sacred space where time collapses into a single moment of reaching out and touching the eternal. The pigments tell their own story of resourcefulness and artistry. The red ochre comes from iron deposits scattered across the Patagonian landscape, ground fine and mixed with animal fat and plant juices to create colours that have survived 10,000 years without fading. The artists blow the pigment around their hands through hollow bird bones, creating negative images that seem to glow against the dark rock. The technique is simple, but the effect is profound hands that appear to be emerging from the stone itself, as if the cave wall were a window into some other dimension where the ancestors still live and breathe. The colours shift across the spectrum of earth tones, red and yellow and orange and purple and black, each hue derived from different minerals and organic materials that the artist gathered from the harsh but generous landscape outside. The variety suggests not just practical knowledge of pigment sources, but an aesthetic sense that found beauty in the full range of colours that the earth could provide. Some handprints overlay others in deliberate compositions, creating layered palimpsests of human presence that speak to intentional artistic choices rather than random placement. The caves preserve more than handprints. Hunting scenes stretch across the walls in flowing narratives that capture the movement of guanaco herds across the steppes. The leap of a vicuña startled by pursuing hunters, the patient stalking of rhea through tall grass that waves in ancient winds. The artists paint their own tools and weapons with careful attention to detail bolas and spear throwers and bows that archaeologists recognize from excavated artifacts found in the same caves. The paintings become a manual of survival techniques, a visual encyclopedia of how to live in one of the world's most challenging environments. The human figures appear in the paintings like dancers frozen in mid-step, their bodies elongated and stylized in ways that suggest movement and energy, rather than realistic portraiture. They hunt and gather and celebrate and mourn, their stick-like forms animated with a vitality that transcends the limitations of primitive technique. Some figures seem to be wearing elaborate headdresses or ceremonial garments, hinting at ritual activities and social structures that remain mysterious despite decades of archaeological investigation. Yet the greatest mystery lies not in what the paintings show, but in what they represent about human consciousness and the need for permanence in a world of constant change. Why did people living on the margin of survival devote precious time and resources to creating art that served no obvious practical purpose? What drove them to return to these caves generation after generation, adding their own marks to walls already crowded with the signatures of their ancestors? The answer may lie in the very human need to transcend the limitations of individual mortality, to participate in something larger and more enduring than a single lifetime. The handprints create a kind of immortality, allowing each person to leave a permanent mark that will outlast their bones and their memories and their spoken words. The caves become repositories of human continuity, places where the living can commune with the dead through the simple act of placing their own hands against the stone where countless others have done the same. The irony is profound. Some of humanity's most sophisticated expressions of symbolic thought and artistic creativity were created by people whom later civilizations would dismiss as primitive savages. The cave artists of Patagonia were developing complex color palettes and compositional techniques at the same time that other humans were still struggling to control fire and fashion, simple stone tools. They were creating multimedia installations that combined painting and sculpture and performance in caves that functioned as theatres and galleries and temples all at once. The preservation of the cave paintings depends on the unique microclimate that exists within the rock shelters. The stable temperature and humidity, protected from the extreme weather of the Patagonian steppes, have kept the pigments intact through 10 millennia of climatic upheaval. But this preservation is fragile, vulnerable to changes in air circulation and moisture levels that could erase in decades what has survived for thousands of years. The caves are time capsules with expiration dates, ancient hard drives that could crash without warning. The modern visitors who come to see the handprints often experience a profound emotional reaction that transcends cultural and temporal boundaries. Standing in the caves, surrounded by the evidence of human presence stretching back into deep time, people report feeling connected to something fundamental about what it means to be human. The handprints seem to reach across the centuries like a greeting, a recognition, an affirmation that the essential human experiences of love and loss and hope and fear have remained constant despite all the surface changes of technology and social organization. The archaeologists who study the caves work with a reverence that borders on the religious. They measure and photograph and analyze with scientific precision. But they also speak of the caves in hushed tones that acknowledge something sacred in this ancient gallery of human expression. The site challenges the usual academic boundaries between art and archaeology, between science and spirituality, between past and present. The handprints refuse to be categorized or explained away. They simply exist, bearing witness to human creativity and the irrepressible urge to make marks that matter. The wind still moves through the Patagonian valleys, carrying with it the voices of people who have been silent for centuries. The caves listen to this ancient conversation, their walls holding the memory of hands that once pressed warm against cold stone, leaving traces of lives that were brief but meaningful, ordinary but eternal. The handprints wait in the darkness like stars waiting for night to fall, ready to shine for anyone willing to enter the caves and bear witness to the persistence of human hope in the face of time's relentless passage. The pigments continue their slow chemical dialogue with the stone, molecules of ochre and bone and plant matter bonding with minerals that formed when the earth was young. The handprints are becoming part of the rock itself, transitioning from human artifact to geological feature, from temporary art to permanent testament. In time, they may outlast the mountains that surround them, these simple marks that say more about human nature than all the monuments that later civilizations would build to proclaim their importance to an indifferent universe. Beneath the grey waters of the North Sea, where fishing trawlers drag their nets through depths that once knew sunshine and the footsteps of children, the drowned landscape of Doggerland rests in silence. The land bridge that connected Britain to continental Europe for thousands of years lies buried under fathoms of salt water, its hills and valleys and river systems preserved in sediment, like a three-dimensional map of a world that vanished when the ice sheets melted and the seas rose to reclaim territory they had surrendered to the cold. The submerged continent spreads across an area larger than modern Britain, its coastlines and watersheds still visible to those who know how to read the seafloor's subtle topography. Sonar surveys reveal the ghost outlines of ancient rivers that once carried fresh water from the highlands to the sea, their channels now filled with marine sediment but still discernible as shallow depressions in the ocean bottom. The Thames and the Rhine flowed as tributaries of a greater river system that drained the interior of a continent that exists now only in the memories held by mud and stone. The people who lived in Doggerland left traces of their presence scattered across the seafloor like seeds waiting for an impossible spring. Fishing nets bring up worked flint tools and fragments of human bone, antler harpoons and wooden artifacts that speak of a sophisticated hunter-gatherer culture adapted to life in a landscape of rivers and wetlands and coastal plains. The finds accumulate in archaeological collections like messages from a lost world, each artifact raising more questions than it answers about the civilization that flourished in Europe's drowned heartland. The tools tell stories of technological innovation and cultural complexity that challenge assumptions about prehistoric life. Barbed harpoon points carved from red deer antler show manufacturing techniques that required years of apprenticeship to master. Wooden fish traps preserved in anaerobic sediments reveal engineering principles that modern fishermen still use. Stone axes polished to mirror smoothness speak of aesthetic sensibilities that went far beyond mere utility, suggesting a culture that valued beauty as much as function. The landscape itself was a hunter-gatherer paradise, rich with resources that supported dense populations across thousands of square miles of temperate woodland and grassland. Herds of aurochs and wild horses grazed the river plains, while salmon ran thick in streams that teemed with life. Hazel groves provided nuts for winter storage, while extensive marshlands offered waterfowl and their eggs in seasonal abundance that could feed entire communities. The archaeological evidence suggests population densities that rival those of early agricultural settlements, achieved through intensive management of wild resources rather than domestication. The settlements cluster along the ancient river valleys like pearls on strings of fresh water. Excavations on dry land that was once part of the Doggerland periphery reveal substantial structures built from timber and stone, with evidence of year-round occupation spanning multiple generations. These were not temporary camps, but permanent communities with complex social organizations, specialized crafts, and trade networks that connected the North Sea basin with the broader European world. Yet the greatest mystery of Doggerland lies not in its archaeology, but in its disappearance. The flooding was not a sudden catastrophe, but a gradual rise that took place over thousands of years as glacial meltwater poured from the warming continents into the world's oceans. The people would have had time to adapt, to move inland as the waters advanced, to adjust their settlements and their way of life to accommodate the changing coastlines. But the archaeological record shows something more complex than simple retreat. The sea level rise accelerated during certain periods, swallowing miles of coastline in decades rather than centuries. Storm surges driven by changing weather patterns may have flooded areas that had been dry for generations, turning familiar landscapes into hostile waters overnight. tsunamis triggered by underwater landslides could have devastated coastal communities, with walls of water that arrived without warning, erasing settlements and their inhabitants from the archaeological record in a matter of hours. The irony of Doggerland's fate resonates across the millennia like an echo from a future that has already arrived. A civilization adapted to rising seas vanished beneath rising seas, its people forced to abandon territories that had supported their ancestors for thousands of years. The parallel to modern climate change is too obvious to ignore, yet too complex to reduce to simple analogies. The Doggerland peoples faced natural climate change over geological timescales. Modern humanity faces anthropogenic change measured in decades rather than millennia. The flooding of Doggerland transformed the geography of northwestern Europe in ways that still shape contemporary politics and culture. Britain became an island, isolated from continental influences that had shaped its development for millennia. The North Sea became a barrier rather than a highway, forcing trade and migration into new channels that connected different regions and different peoples. The cultural unity of the North Sea basin fragmented into the distinct national identities that would eventually produce Vikings and Anglo-Saxons, and the complex medieval world of competing kingdoms. The submerged forests tell their own story of transformation and loss. Peat deposits preserve tree stumps and fallen logs in positions of growth, creating underwater archaeological sites where entire ecosystems lie frozen in time. Oak and pine forests that once stretched for hundreds of miles now exist only as compressed organic matter, buried under marine sediments, their wood still solid enough to be worked with modern tools. The trees died standing as the saltwater advanced, their roots killed by the changing chemistry of soils that had been fresh for thousands of years. The fishing communities that work the North Sea today sometimes speak of the drowned lands, with a mixture of practical knowledge and superstitious awe. Their nets occasionally bring up pieces of worked wood or carved bone that older fishermen recognize as artifacts from the time before the waters. Local folklore preserves stories of bells that ring beneath the waves, and cities glimpsed through clear water during unusually low tides. Tales that may contain fragments of cultural memory passed down through generations of people whose ancestors witnessed the final flooding of the European continent. Marine archaeologists work with equipment that can map the seafloor with extraordinary precision, revealing details of the drowned landscape that would have been invisible to earlier researchers. Side-scan sonar creates images of submerged river channels and ancient coastlines with resolution, measured in centimeters rather than meters. Remote-operated vehicles equipped with cameras explore the underwater sites, where human artifacts lie scattered among modern marine debris, creating a surreal mixture of ancient and contemporary archaeology. The sediment cores extracted from the North Sea bottom preserve environmental records that span the entire period of Doggerland's existence and destruction. Pollen grains and microscopic marine organisms tell the story of changing climates and rising seas with scientific precision, creating a timeline of environmental change that can be calibrated against radiocarbon dates from human artifacts. The data reveals a landscape in constant flux, with vegetation zones and coastlines shifting in response to climatic oscillations that operated on scales both human and geological. The preservation conditions in the North Sea are both exceptional and fragile. The cold, oxygen-poor waters have protected organic artifacts that would have decayed completely in terrestrial environments, creating an archaeological record of unprecedented richness. But the same commercial fishing and offshore development that occasionally recover Doggerland artifacts also threaten the sites where they rest. Trawl nets drag across the seafloor with enough force to destroy archaeological deposits, while oil and gas extraction disturbs sediments that have remained undisturbed since the initial flooding. the water continues its patient work of burial and preservation, adding layers of marine sediment to the Doggerland deposits year by year. The drowned landscape sinks deeper into time as it sinks deeper into the seafloor, its rivers and forests and human settlements becoming part of the geological record that future archaeologists may study as evidence of how civilizations respond to environmental change. The North Sea holds this ancient conversation between land and water, between human ambition and natural forces, between the world that was and the world that is yet to come. The stone pillars rise from the hillside in southeastern Turkey like fingers pointing toward constellations that have wheeled overhead for 12,000 years, their carved surfaces bearing the weight of questions that archaeology cannot answer. Göbekli Tepe stands as humanity's first temple, built by hunter-gatherers who had not yet learned to plant seeds or domesticate animals, yet who somehow found the social organization and technical skill to quarry and transport and erect megaliths that weigh more than modern automobiles. The circular enclosures crown the hill like stone flowers blooming from earth that holds the memory of humanity's first reaching toward the sacred. The excavation proceeds with the delicate patience of surgery, each layer of soil revealing artifacts that push back the boundaries of what scholars thought possible for Paleolithic peoples. Stone tools of extraordinary sophistication emerge from contexts that predate agriculture by millennia, their edges sharp enough to shave hair, and their forms refined through techniques that required generations to perfect. Bone needles thin as modern wire speak of textile production, among people who supposedly lived in simple animal hides. Carved figurines display artistic sensibilities that rival those of much later civilizations, their abstract forms suggesting symbolic thinking of remarkable complexity. The pillars themselves defy easy categorization, standing in circles that follow astronomical alignments with precision that suggests careful observation of celestial cycles over extended periods. T-shaped monoliths carved from local limestone bear reliefs of animals that prowl and fly and slither across their surfaces in processions of symbolic meaning that scholars can only guess at. Foxes and scorpions and birds of prey interweave with abstract symbols that could represent anything from star maps to ritual instructions, to the dreams of shamans whose names are lost to time but whose visions remain etched in stone. The engineering challenges of constructing Göbekli Tepe staggers the imagination when considered in context of the tools and techniques available to its builders. Each pillar required quarrying from bedrock using only flint tools and wooden levers, then transportation across rough terrain without wheels or beasts of burden, then erection into precise positions using methods that left no trace in the archaeological record. The logistics alone suggest a level of social cooperation that contradicts traditional models of hunter-gatherer society as consisting of small, egalitarian bands with simple technologies and seasonal mobility. The site reveals evidence of feasting on a massive scale, with bone deposits from wild cattle and gazelle and wild boar that represent more meat than small groups could consume before spoilage. The concentrations of animal remains suggest periodic gatherings that brought together hundreds or possibly thousands of people from across the region, transforming the hilltop into a kind of ancient conference centre where different groups came together for purposes that combined the religious, the social, and the economic into a single complex event. Yet the most profound mystery of Göbekli Tepe lies not in its construction, but in its deliberate burial. Around 8,000 years ago, the builders or their descendants began the systematic process of covering the entire complex with tons of soil and stone, creating the artificial hill that concealed the temple for millennia until modern archaeology uncovered it. The burial was not the result of natural processes or enemy destruction, but a conscious decision to hide the sacred site, to remove it from the world of the living and consign it to the realm of memory and earth. The reasons for this intentional burial remain as enigmatic as the site's original purpose. Perhaps the advent of agriculture made the hunter-gatherer rituals obsolete, requiring the old sacred spaces to be retired like worn-out tools. Perhaps social changes accompanying the Neolithic Revolution created new power structures that could not tolerate the egalitarian implications of the ancient temple. Perhaps the burial was itself a sacred act, a way of preserving the site's spiritual power by removing it from the corrupting influence of daily life. The carvings on the pillars hint at cosmological knowledge that seems impossibly advanced for its time period. The positioning of animal figures appears to correspond to constellation patterns, suggesting that the builders possessed sophisticated understanding of astronomical cycles and their relationship to terrestrial seasons. The recurring motifs of death and rebirth, predator and prey, earth and sky, may represent an early attempt to create a unified theory of existence that explained the relationship between human consciousness and cosmic order. The social implications of Göbekli Tepe's construction challenge fundamental assumptions about the development of complex civilization. The traditional narrative suggests that agriculture created food surpluses that allowed for craft specialization and monumental architecture. But here stands evidence of monumental architecture that predates agriculture by thousands of years. The sequence may be reversed. Perhaps the need to gather periodically at sacred sites created the social pressures that led to agricultural experimentation as a way of supporting larger and more stable populations. The irony deepens with each season of excavation. The world's first temple was built by people who had no permanent temples, no priesthood, no written records to preserve their rituals and beliefs. The world's first monumental architecture was created by nomadic peoples who left no permanent settlements, no palaces, no obvious centers of political power. The world's first evidence of organized religion comes from a society that supposedly lacked the social complexity necessary for organized religion. The limestone weathers slowly under the Anatolian sun, its surface gradually softening as wind and rain work their patient erosion on carvings that have survived 12 millennia of seasons. The excavation teams race against this natural decay, documenting and preserving details that fade a little more each year. The stone that seemed eternal to its builders proves as fragile as human memory, vulnerable to the same forces of time that have erased so many other monuments to human ambition and spiritual longing. The surrounding landscape bears traces of the quarries where the builders extracted their raw materials, following limestone veins deep into the earth with techniques that left scars still visible after thousands of years. The scale of the quarrying operations suggests industrial-level organization among people who supposedly lived in small, temporary camps. Thousands of tons of stone were removed and shaped and transported, requiring coordination and planning on a scale that seems impossible without written records and permanent administrative structures. The fill that covers the unexcavated portions of Göbekli Tepe contains artifacts that span millennia, creating a chronological puzzle that archaeologists are still trying to solve. Tools and pottery and animal bones from different periods lie mixed together in the burial deposits, as if successive generations added their own contributions to the growing mound that concealed the ancient temple. The site became a palimpsest of human occupation, each layer adding new mysteries to the original enigma of the stone circles. The modern visitors who climb the hill to see the excavated portions of Göbekli Tepe often report a sense of profound disorientation, as if the site exists in a different temporal dimension from the surrounding countryside. The pillar circles create spaces that feel simultaneously ancient and timeless. Their stone surfaces warm to the touch, despite the cool mountain air. The carved animals seem to move in peripheral vision, their stylized forms animated by shadows that shift with the sun's passage across the sky, that has witnessed humanity's first attempts to build bridges between earth and heaven. The wind carries dust from the excavations across the hillside, mixing particles from different millennia in clouds that settle on modern equipment and ancient stone alike. The boundaries between past and present blur in this fine sediment that coats everything with the democracy of time, reducing human ambition and cosmic mystery to the same neutral grey that covers all things equally. The pillars wait in their circles like ancient sentries, guarding secrets that may be too profound for modern minds to comprehend. Their carved surfaces holding conversations with the stars that began before agriculture and continue long after the last archaeologist has packed away their tools and cameras and carefully catalogued questions. The desert remembers when it was green, beneath the endless dunes of the Sahara, where sand shifts like slow-motion ocean waves across a landscape that seems hostile to all life. The buried rivers hold their ancient secrets in channels, carved deep into bedrock that last felt flowing water when the world was young and wet and generous with rain. The satellites see what human eyes cannot, the spectral signatures of vanished waterways that once supported civilizations as complex as any that flourished along the Nile or the Euphrates. Their ghost outlines visible only to instruments that can peer through sand and time to reveal the green heart of Africa's hidden past. The rivers flowed for thousands of years through a Sahara transformed by monsoons that brought life-giving precipitation from the Atlantic and the Indian Ocean, turning what is now the world's largest hot desert into a vast grassland dotted with lakes and wetlands that teemed with wildlife. Hippos wallowed in waters that are now solid sand. Crocodiles basked on riverbanks where only scorpions and beetles survive today. Elephants and giraffes and ancient cattle browsed through acacia groves that stretched from the Atlantic coast to the Red Sea, their migration routes following seasonal patterns that persisted for millennia before the rains failed and the green world withered into memory. The people who lived along these vanished rivers built settlements that reveal remarkable sophistication in their adaptation to a dynamic environment where water levels rose and fell with monsoon cycles that operated on both annual and millennial timescales. Archaeological excavations in what are now waterless valleys have uncovered house foundations and pottery workshops and granaries that speak of permanent communities sustained by agriculture, fishing, and the management of cattle herds that numbered in the thousands. These were not nomadic peoples scratching out marginal existences in a hostile environment, but complex societies with specialized crafts, trade networks, and social hierarchies. The rock art scattered across the Saharan massifs tells the story of this transformation, in images that span thousands of years of cultural development and environmental change. The earliest paintings show hunters pursuing wild game through landscapes of rivers and forests, their figures animated with the confident movements of people who knew their environment intimately. Later periods reveal the gradual domestication of cattle and the development of pastoral societies that followed seasonal migration routes between highland pastures and lowland grazing areas. The final phases of rock art show the increasing aridity that forced human populations to concentrate around shrinking water sources before abandoning the desert entirely to the sand and wind. The buried cities emerge from satellite surveys like three-dimensional maps of lost civilizations, their street patterns and defensive walls still visible as subtle variations in surface texture and mineral composition. Ground-penetrating radar reveals the full extent of these settlements, showing urban areas that covered hundreds of acres and supported populations that must have numbered in the tens of thousands. The cities cluster along the courses of the ancient rivers like beads on strings of vanished water, connected by trade routes that crossed the Green Sahara when it was not a barrier but a highway between sub-Saharan Africa and the Mediterranean world. The pottery styles found in Saharan archaeological sites show influences from regions thousands of miles apart, evidence of trade networks that connected the interior of Africa with the Nile Valley, the Mediterranean coast, and possibly even the distant civilizations of Mesopotamia and the Indus Valley. Exotic materials like copper and precious stones appear in contexts that suggest not occasional contact, but regular commercial relationships that persisted for centuries. The Green Sahara was not an isolated backwater but a crucial link in early global trade networks that connected three continents. Yet the transformation from garden to wasteland happened with a speed that seems almost catastrophic when measured against human lifespans, though gradual when considered on geological timescales. The monsoon systems that brought annual floods gradually shifted southward as solar radiation patterns changed with the slow wobble of Earth's axis, reducing precipitation across the Sahara by increments that accumulated over centuries into drought that has persisted for 5,000 years. The rivers slowed to seasonal streams, then to chains of pools, then to dry beds marked only by the vegetation that survived on groundwater seepage. The abandonment of the Saharan cities was not a single exodus, but a gradual migration that took place over generations as communities followed the retreating shorelines of lakes that shrank year by year into salt pans and playas. Some populations moved south into the Sahel and the river valleys that still received adequate rainfall. Others migrated north toward the Mediterranean, carrying with them technologies and cultural practices that would influence the development of Egyptian and North African civilizations. A few groups may have remained in highland refugia, where springs and seasonal rainfall could still support small populations. The irony of the Sahara's transformation lies in its contribution to human cultural development through the very process of its desiccation. The environmental pressures that made the desert uninhabitable for complex societies forced innovations in water management, long-distance trade, and social organization that spread throughout Africa and beyond. The descendants of Saharan peoples carried with them knowledge of metallurgy, animal husbandry, and astronomical observation that enriched the civilizations where they eventually settled. The underground rivers that once supported Saharan cities continued to flow beneath the sand, their aquifers fed by rainfall that fell thousands of years ago and has been slowly moving through porous rock layers ever since. Modern drilling reveals these fossil waters at depths that make them accessible to contemporary technology, but were beyond the reach of ancient peoples. The water table that once lay near the surface now rests hundreds of feet below the desert floor, preserved like liquid time in geological formations that may hold these reserves for thousands of years to come. The archaeological sites buried in the sand face destruction from wind erosion and human activity that proceeds faster than scientific investigation can document their contents. The same forces that preserve these ancient settlements by covering them with protective layers of sand now threaten to scatter their artifacts across the desert as climate change and increased human activity alter the delicate equilibrium that has kept them intact for millennia. The sites are time capsules with expiration dates, ancient hard drives that could be wiped clean before their contents are fully recovered and understood. The buried rivers reveal themselves in unexpected ways to those who know how to read the subtle signs that water leaves in even the driest landscapes. Palm trees growing in apparently random patterns across the desert often mark the courses of underground streams. Salt deposits and unusual mineral concentrations indicate places where ancient springs once reached the surface. Even the behavior of sand dunes follows patterns influenced by bedrock topography carved by rivers that disappeared before the pyramids were built. The climatic records preserved in lake sediments and cave deposits show that the Sahara has undergone multiple cycles of greening and desiccation over the past million years. With humid periods recurring roughly every 20,000 years in response to orbital cycles that affect the distribution of solar energy across Earth's surface. The current arid phase is not permanent, but part of a natural rhythm that will eventually bring the monsoons back to North Africa, though not for thousands of years to come. The modern descendants of Saharan peoples preserve oral traditions that may contain memories of the green desert transmitted through countless generations of storytelling. Creation myths and migration legends speak of times when their ancestors lived beside great waters in lands that are now sand, their narratives preserving fragments of environmental history that complement the archaeological and geological evidence for the Sahara's transformation. These stories exist like buried rivers of cultural memory, flowing beneath the surface of contemporary consciousness and occasionally emerging in dreams and songs and ceremonial practices. The sand continues its slow work of burial and preservation, covering the traces of human habitation with layers that protect them from the sun and wind and the corrosive effects of rare rainfall. The desert has become an archive of human adaptation and environmental change, its buried cities and abandoned settlements waiting like libraries in languages not yet deciphered. The dunes shift and settle according to patterns that operate on scales both daily and millennial, revealing and concealing the evidence of lost civilizations with the patient rhythm of geological time. The wind carries across the emptiness the whispered stories of peoples who once crowded the riverbanks and lake shores of a green Sahara, their voices preserved in the movement of sand that was once the soil of their fields and the clay of their pottery. The desert listens to these ancient conversations, holding them in the spaces between grains of quartz and feldspar that remember when they were mountains, before they became beaches, before they became the floors of seas that dried into the vast silence that now covers the heart of Africa like a blanket of time and forgetting and patient, eternal waiting. In the frozen ground of Siberia, where permafrost holds the memory of ice ages in crystalline suspension, and the aurora borealis paints the winter sky with colours that have no names, the bone needles rest in archaeological layers that speak of human ingenuity, triumphing over conditions that would challenge modern survival equipment 40,000 years before the first cotton was spun or the first sheep was sheared. The ancestors of all non-African humans were crafting sewing implements from the leg bones of birds with a precision that rivals contemporary manufacturing, their tools thin as wire and sharp as surgical instruments, designed for creating garments that meant the difference between life and death in the planet's most unforgiving environments. The needles emerge from excavation sites across the northern reaches of Eurasia, like messages from a time when survival required not just courage and endurance, but technological innovation of the highest order. Each implement represents hours of careful work, the slow grinding of bone against stone to achieve the perfect balance between strength and flexibility. The delicate drilling of eye holes using flint awls rotated between patient palms until the calcium phosphate surrendered to human persistence. The tools the result are marvels of engineering, their surfaces polished smooth, and their point sharp enough to pierce the toughest hide without tearing the precious fibers that would become the barrier between human skin and the killing cold of glacial winters. The sites where these needles are found tell stories of adaptation that boggle the imagination when considered against the environmental challenges their makers face daily. Temperatures that regularly dropped 40 degrees below freezing, winds that could strip exposed flesh in minutes, darkness that lasted for months at latitudes where the sun barely cleared the horizon even in summer. Yet humans not only survived these conditions, but thrived, creating tools and technologies and social systems that allowed them to populate the northern world and eventually cross the land bridge into the Americas, carrying with them the knowledge of textile production that would prove essential for colonizing climates even more extreme than those they left behind. The preservation of organic materials in permafrost creates archaeological conditions that exist nowhere else on Earth, allowing researchers to recover not just the needles themselves, but fragments of the textiles they were used to create. Microscopic analysis of these ancient fabrics reveals sophisticated techniques for spinning plant fibers and animal fur into threads, then weaving or knitting these threads into materials with specific properties designed for different applications. Some fragments show tight weaves that would have been waterproof, others loose constructions that maximized insulation through trapped air. The variety suggests a deep understanding of textile physics that developed through generations of experimentation and refinement. The raw materials for this textile revolution came from the harsh but surprisingly rich ecosystem of glacial Siberia, where cold-adapted plants and animals provided fibers and fur and sinew that ingenious humans learned to transform into life-sustaining garments. Mammoth hair could be spun into coarse but durable thread. Bird down provided unmatched insulation when properly contained within outer layers. Plant fibers from Arctic willows and other hardy species offered materials that remained flexible even when frozen. The needles made it possible to combine these diverse materials into composite garments that modern outdoor equipment manufacturers are only beginning to understand and replicate. The social implications of advanced textile production in Ice Age Siberia extend far beyond the simple mechanics of staying warm. The time and skill required to create sophisticated garments meant that clothing became a form of wealth, a marker of social status, and potentially a medium of exchange in societies where metal money did not exist. The most skilled seamsters and seamstresses would have held positions of great importance, their knowledge essential for group survival and their products valuable enough to trade across vast distances. The needles become symbols not just of technological achievement, but of social complexity in societies that archaeological theory has often portrayed as brutally simple. Yet mysteries multiply around these ancient sewing implements, like frost forming on winter windows. How did Ice Age peoples develop the specialized knowledge necessary to select bird bones with exactly the right properties for needle manufacture? What techniques did they use to heat treat the bone to achieve optimal hardness without making it brittle? How did they manage the logistics of textile production during the constant migrations necessary for survival in environments where resources were scattered and seasonal? The archaeological record preserves the tools but not the cultural knowledge that made their use possible. The needles tell stories of innovation under pressure that resonate across the millennia to contemporary challenges of human adaptation. Just as modern space programs develop new technologies to protect astronauts from hostile environments, Ice Age peoples created textile solutions for surviving in conditions that were literally otherworldly by the standards of their tropical ancestors. The development of sophisticated sewing technology may have been one of the key innovations that allowed humans to expand their range beyond the warm climates where their species evolved, opening up vast territories that would eventually support billions of descendants. The irony embedded in these tiny tools becomes apparent when their sophistication is compared to the crude stereotypes that popular culture associates with Ice Age humans. While Hollywood depicts cavemen wearing simple animal skins, the archaeological reality shows peoples creating complex textile systems that required knowledge of materials, science, engineering principles, and manufacturing techniques that took generations to perfect. The bone needles are evidence of intellectual achievements that rival any produced by later civilizations, accomplished by brains identical to our own, but operating under environmental pressures that contemporary humans can barely imagine. The preservation conditions that protect these ancient artifacts also threaten their continued existence, as climate change alters the permafrost conditions that have kept them frozen for tens of thousands of years. Rising temperatures cause the permanently frozen ground to thaw, exposing organic materials to decay processes that can destroy in decades what has survived for millennia. The archaeological sites are melting away like ice cubes in summer heat, their contents racing toward destruction faster than scientists can excavate and study them. The manufacturing techniques revealed by microscopic analysis of the bone needles show evidence of standardization that suggests formal teaching and learning systems rather than casual trial and error experimentation. The tools share design characteristics across thousands of miles and thousands of years, indicating that knowledge was being transmitted systematically from teacher to student, from generation to generation, with enough consistency to maintain quality standards across vast spans of time and space. This implies educational institutions or apprenticeship systems that contradict models of Ice Age society as consisting of small, isolated bands with little cultural continuity. The global distribution of similar bone needle technologies suggests that the invention spread rapidly across the human populations that were colonizing northern Eurasia, carried by the same migration networks that distributed other crucial innovations like improved stone tools and fire-making techniques. The needles become markers of cultural diffusion, evidence of communication and cooperation between groups separated by hundreds of miles of dangerous terrain. The technology was too valuable to remain localized, too essential for survival to be hoarded by its inventors. The modern indigenous peoples of Siberia preserve traditional knowledge of textile production that may contain echoes of techniques developed by their Ice Age ancestors, passed down through unbroken chains of cultural transmission that span 40,000 years. Contemporary Chukchi and Nenets craftspeople still create garments, using methods that achieve remarkable effectiveness with simple tools. Their knowledge representing libraries of survival information accumulated over hundreds of generations of life in the Arctic. The bone needles connect these contemporary traditions to the deepest roots of human technological achievement. The sites yield evidence of needle manufacturing workshops, where multiple craftspeople work together to produce tools in quantities that suggest production for trade rather than just local use. Concentrations of bone debris, partially finished needles, and specialized grinding stones indicate organized manufacturing centers where skilled artisans created surplus tools for exchange with other groups. The workshops represent some of humanity's earliest factories, places where individual craftsmanship scaled up to meet the demands of expanding populations that needed ever more sophisticated equipment for survival in challenging environments. The wind still moves across the Siberian tundra, carrying with it the whispered voices of peoples who conquered the cold through ingenuity and cooperation, and the patient accumulation of knowledge that turned bird bones into instruments of survival. The permafrost continues its slow surrender to warming temperatures, releasing the frozen archives of human adaptation back into a world that has forgotten how much it owes to the makers of the first needles, the inventors of the first textiles, the ancestors who learned to dress themselves against the dark and carry human consciousness into the farthest reaches of a planet that seemed determined to freeze them out of existence, across the red heart of Australia, where the land stretches in every direction toward horizons that shimmer with heat and distance. The shell roads wind through landscapes that seem empty to casual observers, but pulse with the memory of 50,000 years of human movement. The trade routes follow paths worn into bedrock by countless generations of feet, connecting water sources and sacred sites and seasonal camps across a continent that outsiders would later dismiss as wilderness, but that indigenous peoples knew as intimately as the veins in their own hands. The shells travel along these ancient highways like currency made from the sea itself, carrying with them the salt tang of distant oceans and the accumulated wisdom of the world's oldest continuous trade networks. The shells begin their journeys on beaches thousands of miles from their final destinations, gathered by coastal peoples who understand the value that these marine treasures hold for communities that live where the sea is only a memory preserved in stories passed down from the dreamtime. Pearl shells from the northwest coast, with their lustrous inner surfaces that catch light like captured moonbeams. Cowrie shells from tropical waters, smooth and perfect as polished stones. Baler shells large enough to hold water for entire families, their curved surfaces worn smooth by waves that broke on beaches when the world was young, and the first humans were learning to read the songlines that connected all things across the vast Australian landscape. These shells move inland along trade routes that follow the subtle geography of a continent where water is life, and knowledge of its location means the difference between survival and death in landscapes that can kill the unprepared in a matter of hours. The paths connect billabongs and rock holes and seasonal streams in networks that span thousands of kilometers, their routes memorized in songs that serve simultaneously as maps, histories, and spiritual guides. The traders who carry shells along these ancient highways navigate by stars and landforms and the accumulated knowledge of generations, their journeys transforming commerce into ceremony and exchange into spiritual obligation. The archaeological evidence for these trade networks emerges from excavations across the continent like pieces of a vast puzzle that archaeologists are still learning to assemble. Shell artifacts appear in rock shelters hundreds of miles from the nearest coastline, their presence evidence of exchange relationships that persisted for thousands of years, despite the distances and dangers involved in maintaining contact across such hostile terrain. Radiocarbon dating of shell deposits shows continuous trade spanning millennia, with some routes operating for longer than recorded human history in other parts of the world. The logistics of long-distance trade across the Australian interior staggers the imagination when considered against the environmental challenges that traders faced on every journey. Temperatures that could exceed 50 degrees Celsius in summer, water sources separated by hundreds of miles of trackless desert, navigation challenges that required intimate knowledge of seasonal patterns and stellar movements. Yet the archaeological record shows not occasional contact but regular commerce, with shells moving along established routes that operated like highways, connecting distant communities in webs of mutual obligation and shared identity. The shells carry more than decorative or utilitarian value as they move along the ancient trade routes. They serve as symbols of social relationships, markers of ceremonial status, and repositories of spiritual power that connects inland peoples to the ancestral energies of the sea. The pearl shells become particularly sacred objects, their luminous surfaces believed to hold the essence of water spirits and ancestral beings who shaped the landscape during the dream time. The shells transform from marine artifacts into terrestrial treasures, their meaning deepening with each mile they travel from their oceanic origins. Yet the greatest mystery of the Australian shell roads lies not in their extent, but in their antiquity. Archaeological evidence suggests that these trade networks were operating at full complexity when the first Europeans arrived, but radiocarbon dating pushes their origins back tens of thousands of years into the deep past of human occupation on the continent. The roots may represent some of humanity's oldest commercial relationships, trade networks that were ancient when the pyramids were built and that continued operating until European colonization disrupted social systems that had persisted since the Pleistocene. The maintenance of these trade networks across such vast distances and challenging environments required social institutions of remarkable sophistication. Trust mechanisms had to exist to ensure that shells given in one location would be reciprocated with goods received hundreds of miles away and months or years later. Communication systems had to operate across language barriers and cultural differences to coordinate exchanges between groups that might share little beyond their participation in the continental trade network. Conflict resolution mechanisms had to prevent disputes from disrupting commerce that entire communities depended upon for access to sacred and utilitarian materials. The irony of the shell roads becomes apparent when their sophistication is compared to European assumptions about Australian Aboriginal societies. Colonial observers dismissed indigenous peoples as primitive nomads without permanent settlements or complex social organisations. Yet the archaeological evidence reveals commercial networks that operated on a scale comparable to the Silk Road, and with a longevity that exceeded any European trading system. The shells moved along routes that connected the entire continent in webs of reciprocal obligation that sustained both material and spiritual needs across some of the most challenging environments on Earth. The routes themselves become inscribed in the landscape through the accumulated effects of thousands of years of human passage. Footpaths worn into solid rock mark the passage of countless travellers, their depressions still visible despite decades of disuse following the disruption of traditional life by European settlement. Water sources along the routes show evidence of human management through stone arrangements that directed seasonal flows and excavations that increased storage capacity. Campsites preserve layers of occupation spanning millennia, their artifacts documenting the evolution of trade goods and exchange relationships over time periods that dwarf recorded history. The modern descendants of the peoples who created and maintained these ancient trade networks preserve knowledge of the roots in oral traditions that encode geographical information with precision that amazes contemporary cartographers. The songlines that guide navigation across seemingly featureless terrain contain detailed descriptions of landmarks, water sources, and seasonal patterns that allow skilled navigators to traverse thousands of miles of desert with confidence. The songs function as living maps, their verses preserving information accumulated over countless generations of travel along routes that connected the farthest reaches of the continent. The shells continue to move along some of these ancient pathways, though their journeys now serve cultural preservation rather than purely economic purposes. Contemporary indigenous communities maintain traditional exchange relationships as part of efforts to preserve cultural knowledge and strengthen connections between groups separated by the disruptions of colonization. The shells carry with them not just the memories of ancient trade, but the hopes for cultural continuity in a modern world that often struggles to value indigenous knowledge and traditional ways of life. The archaeological investigation of shell road networks reveals evidence of adaptive management strategies that allowed these ancient trade systems to survive environmental changes that would have disrupted more rigid commercial arrangements. During drought periods, alternative routes opened up to connect different water sources. During times of social conflict, diplomatic protocols activated to maintain essential exchanges while minimizing dangerous contact between hostile groups. The networks possessed resilience characteristics that modern supply chain managers are only beginning to understand and appreciate. The preservation of shell artifacts in the Australian interior depends on climatic conditions that vary dramatically across the continent. In some regions, the dry conditions and stable temperatures of rock shelters protect organic materials for thousands of years. In other areas, seasonal flooding and temperature extremes can destroy archaeological evidence within decades of deposition. The sites that preserve evidence of the shell roads are time capsules whose contents are gradually being revealed by systematic archaeological investigation. But many more sites have been lost to development, erosion, and the simple passage of time. The scientific study of ancient shell trade networks requires collaboration between archaeologists and indigenous knowledge holders who understand the cultural significance of the artifacts and the landscapes where they are found. The shells are not just archaeological specimens, but sacred objects that carry spiritual power and cultural meaning that extends far beyond their material properties. The research necessarily becomes a cross-cultural dialogue that enriches scientific understanding while respecting the intellectual property and spiritual beliefs of the communities whose ancestors created these remarkable networks. The wind still moves across the Australian interior, carrying dust from roads that have been travelled for 50,000 years by peoples who understood that survival in harsh environments requires cooperation, reciprocity, and the patient maintenance of relationships that connect communities across vast distances. The shells rest in museum cases and private collections around the world, their lustrous surfaces reflecting lights that their makers never imagined. But their true value lies in the evidence they provide of human ingenuity and adaptability, and the ancient wisdom that recognized the ocean's gifts as treasures worthy of continental journeys across landscapes that seem determined to test every limit of human endurance and determination. In the flooded limestone caverns beneath Mexico's Yucatan Peninsula, where fresh water meets salt in underground rivers that have flowed in darkness since the last ice age, the cenotes hold their ancient secrets in cathedral spaces carved by water and time. The diving archaeologists descend through shafts of filtered sunlight into chambers where stalactites grow like stone icicles, toward pools that mirror the surface world in perfect stillness, their lights revealing human skulls and mastodon bones and artifacts that speak of civilizations that flourished when the sea level was 300 feet lower, and these underwater caves were dry passages through which the earliest Americans walked toward their continental destiny. The cenotes punctuate the Yucatan landscape like windows into the underworld, their circular openings created when the limestone bedrock collapsed to reveal the vast aquifer system that underlies the entire peninsula. The Maya knew these water sources as sacred portals to Xibalba, the place of fright where gods and ancestors dwelt among the stalactite forests of the underground realm. Modern cave divers know them as some of the world's most challenging archaeological sites, where artifacts from the Pleistocene rest in chambers that require technical diving skills to reach and underwater excavation techniques to investigate without destroying the delicate sedimentary context that preserve evidence of humanity's earliest presence in the Americas. The human remains emerge from the cave sediments like revelations written in calcium and time, their bones stained dark by minerals dissolved from limestone that has been filtering groundwater for millions of years. The skeletons rest where their owners died more than 12,000 years ago, when these caves were dry and the people who sheltered in them were among the first humans to set foot on the American continents. Their bones tell stories of adaptation and survival in environments that changed dramatically as the ice sheets melted and the rising seas flooded the passages where generations had lived and died and been buried according to ritual traditions that archaeology can only guess at. The preservation conditions in the flooded caves create archaeological environments that exist nowhere else on Earth, where organic materials survive submerged for thousands of years in water that maintains constant temperature and chemical composition. Wooden artifacts retain their original grain structure despite being underwater since the end of the Pleistocene. Textiles preserve details of weaving techniques used by peoples who lived when mammoths still roamed North America. Even delicate materials like feathers and plant fibers survive in the anaerobic conditions of the deep cave chambers, creating an archaeological record of unprecedented completeness for understanding the daily lives of the earliest Americans. The artifacts scattered across the cave floors tell stories of sophisticated technologies and complex social behaviors among peoples whom traditional archaeological models have portrayed as simple, big game hunters following megafauna across the Bering Land Bridge. Stone tools show manufacturing techniques that required years of training to master. Bone implements reveal detailed knowledge of animal anatomy and the properties of different skeletal materials. Wooden spear throwers display artistic decoration that goes far beyond utilitarian necessity, suggesting aesthetic sensibilities and possibly religious beliefs that invested hunting weapons with spiritual as well as practical significance. Yet the greatest mysteries of the cenote archaeology lie not in what the sites contain, but in what their contents reveal about the timing and roots of human colonization of the Americas. The radiocarbon dates from the underwater caves push back the timeline of human presence in Mexico by thousands of years, suggesting that people were living in the Yucatan when the Ice Age was at its peak, and much of northern North America was covered by glaciers. The implications challenge traditional migration models that envision humans entering the Americas through an ice-free corridor between the retreating ice sheets, suggesting instead that coastal routes or even direct oceanic crossings may have brought the first Americans to their new continent. The underwater excavations require technical diving skills that push the limits of human endurance and safety. With archaeologists working in environments where equipment malfunction or navigation error could prove fatal, the cave systems extend for hundreds of miles through the limestone bedrock, creating three-dimensional mazes where divers can become lost in passages that all look identical in the limited sphere of artificial illumination. The archaeological work proceeds with extreme caution, each dive planned and executed with the precision of a military operation, each artifact location recorded with GPS coordinates that will allow future researchers to return to the exact spots where discoveries were made. The sedimentary layers in the caves preserve environmental records that document the dramatic climate changes that occurred during the transition from the Ice Age to the modern world. Pollen grains and microscopic organisms show how vegetation zones shifted as temperatures rose and precipitation patterns changed. The water chemistry preserved in flowstone deposits reveals how the underground hydrology responded to sea level rise and the infiltration of salt water from the advancing ocean. The caves become libraries of environmental change, their deposits readable by specialists who can extract detailed climate histories from mineral formations and organic remains. The irony of the cenote discoveries deepens with each season of underwater archaeology. The sites that were most accessible to Ice Age peoples, the dry cave passages where they lived and worked and raised their families, are now completely inaccessible except to technical divers with advanced training and expensive equipment. The rising seas that made the caves uninhabitable also preserved them from the looting and disturbance that have damaged so many terrestrial archaeological sites. The flood that ended one chapter of human history began another chapter of archaeological preservation that continues today. The human skulls that emerge from the cave sediments bear facial features that appear distinct from those of later Native American populations, raising questions about the relationships between the earliest Americans and the indigenous peoples who were living in the Americas when Europeans arrived. Some researchers suggest that the Pleistocene Americans represent a separate migration event, possibly from different source populations in Asia or even from other continents entirely. Others argue that the apparent differences result from evolutionary changes that occurred over thousands of years of adaptation to American environments and should not be interpreted as evidence of separate ancestral origins. The cave art preserved in some of the cenotes adds another layer of mystery to the archaeological puzzle, with paintings and handprints that may date to the end of the Ice Age, but that show stylistic similarities to rock art traditions found throughout the Americas. The underwater galleries become some of humanity's earliest art museums, their walls decorated with images that survived the flooding, because they were painted in chambers that became sealed from air circulation when the water rose. The art suggests sophisticated symbolic thinking and possibly religious practices among peoples who are often portrayed as focused exclusively on survival in harsh environments. The preservation of the cenote sites depends on maintaining the delicate chemical balance of the groundwater system that has protected organic materials for thousands of years. Changes in surface land use, groundwater extraction, and pollution can alter the cave environments in ways that could accelerate the decay of archaeological materials that have survived since the Pleistocene. The sites are time capsules with expiration dates, their contents racing toward destruction as development pressure increases throughout the rapidly growing Yucatan Peninsula. The modern Maya communities that live above the cenotes maintain traditional knowledge of the underground realm that complements the scientific understanding developed by archaeologists and cave divers. The cenotes remain sacred sites in contemporary Maya cosmology, places where offerings are made to ancestral spirits, and where the boundaries between the world of the living and the world of the dead become permeable. The archaeological investigations necessarily involve dialogue between scientific and indigenous worldviews, creating collaborations that enrich both academic knowledge and cultural understanding. The diving archaeologists work in cathedral spaces where silence is broken only by the sound of their breathing apparatus and the occasional drip of water from stalactites that have been growing since before humans arrived in the Americas. The underwater excavations proceed with surgical precision in environments where every movement must be calculated to avoid stirring up sediments that could reduce visibility to zero in seconds. The work requires not just archaeological expertise, but technical diving skills that few researchers possess, creating a specialized field where scientific training intersect with extreme sports techniques. The cenotes continue their patient work of preservation and revelation, their underground rivers carrying the memory of Ice Age Americas through chambers that have never known sunlight. The bones rest where they fell thousands of years ago, their calcium slowly becoming part of the limestone matrix that will eventually transform them into fossils for future archaeologists to discover. The water moves through these ancient spaces like time itself, fluid and persistent and patient, carrying with it the dissolved minerals that will someday become the flowstone that preserves today's artifacts for tomorrow's scientists to puzzle over in chambers that exist at the intersection of water and stone and the endless human quest to understand where we came from and how we got here. On the limestone islands of Malta, where the Mediterranean sun bakes white stone cliffs that rise from blue water like ancient fortresses, the megalithic temples stand as humanity's first architectural monuments, their massive blocks fitted together with precision that rivals any later construction but predates the pyramids by more than 1,000 years. The temples cluster across the small archipelago like stone flowers blooming from bedrock, their curved walls and underground chambers creating sacred spaces where Neolithic peoples gathered for purposes that archaeology can only guess at, but that clearly required communal efforts on a scale that challenges every assumption about the capabilities of Stone Age societies. The construction of these monuments staggers the imagination when considered against the limitations of their builders' technology. Each temple required quarrying thousands of tons of limestone using only flint tools and wooden levers, then transporting the massive blocks across rough terrain without wheels or beasts of burden, then lifting them into position using techniques that left no trace in the archaeological record. The largest stones weigh more than 50 tons, requiring coordination between dozens of workers using methods that modern engineers struggle to replicate even with mechanical assistance. The megalithic temples represent some of humanity's earliest experiments in monumental architecture, achieved through social cooperation and technical innovation that preceded the development of metal tools by millennia. The temple interiors reveal architectural sophistication that seems impossibly advanced for their time period. Curved walls create acoustic environments where whispers carry from one chamber to another with startling clarity, suggesting that the builders understood principles of sound transmission and deliberately designed spaces for ceremonies that involved chanting, singing, or spoken rituals. Doorways align with astronomical events, indicating knowledge of celestial cycles and their relationship to seasonal patterns that governed agricultural and religious calendars. Underground chambers connect different temple complexes through passages that may have served practical or symbolic purposes, creating networks of sacred space that extended beyond individual monuments. The artifacts recovered from temple excavations tell stories of complex religious practices and sophisticated artistic traditions among peoples whom traditional archaeology has portrayed as simple farmers struggling to survive on resource-poor islands. Stone sculptures display artistic sensibilities that rival those of much later civilizations, their abstract forms suggesting symbolic thinking and aesthetic theories that required generations to develop. Pottery vessels show decorative techniques and firing methods that demonstrate advanced ceramic technology. Personal ornaments made from imported materials reveal trade networks that connected Malta to distant regions of the Mediterranean world. Yet the most profound mysteries of the Maltese temples lie not in their construction, but in their purpose, and the reasons for their eventual abandonment. The monuments show no evidence of defensive features, suggesting that they were built by peaceful societies that did not fear external threats. The lack of obvious burial context indicates that they were not funerary monuments, like the contemporary megalithic tombs found elsewhere in Europe. The absence of clear domestic features suggests that they were not residential structures, but specialized buildings designed for activities that left few archaeological traces. The temple complexes reveal evidence of ritual practices that may have involved the manipulation of sound, light, and space to create transcendent experiences for participants in ceremonies that combined religious, social, and possibly therapeutic functions. Oracle chambers with unusual acoustic properties could have amplified human voices to create supernatural effects. Carefully positioned openings allowed dramatic shafts of sunlight to illuminate specific chambers at astronomically significant moments. The underground passages may have been used for initiation rituals that symbolically represented death and rebirth through movement from darkness into light. The irony of Malta's megalithic achievement becomes apparent when the monument's sophistication is compared to the limited resources available to their builders. The islands possessed no metal ores, no large timber resources, no navigable rivers, and relatively poor agricultural soils. Yet they supported populations capable of creating architectural monuments that required thousands of hours of coordinated labour. The temples represent triumph over environmental limitations through social organisation and technological innovation, demonstrating that monumental architecture was possible even in marginal environments where survival itself was a daily challenge. The abandonment of the temple complexes around 2500 BCE remains one of archaeology's great unsolved mysteries. The monuments were not destroyed by warfare or natural disasters, but simply ceased to be used, their ceremonial functions apparently no longer relevant to the societies that had built and maintained them for over 1,000 years. Some sites show evidence of deliberate closure, with doorways blocked and chambers filled with rubble, as if the temples were being formally decommissioned rather than merely abandoned. The reasons for this systematic termination of Malta's megalithic tradition may be connected to cultural changes accompanying the arrival of Bronze Age technologies and new populations from the European mainland. The construction techniques revealed by architectural analysis of the temples show evidence of engineering knowledge that seems remarkably advanced for societies that lacked written records to preserve and transmit technical information. The builders understood principles of load distribution, structural stability, and foundation construction that allowed their monuments to survive nearly 6,000 years of earthquakes, storms, and human interference. The precision of stone cutting and fitting rivals that of much later civilizations that possessed metal tools and mathematical systems for calculating architectural proportions, the temple art reveals symbolic systems that may represent some of humanity's earliest attempts at creating coherent mythological narratives expressed through visual media. Spiral motifs that appear throughout the monuments could represent cyclical concepts of time, death, and rebirth, or astronomical phenomena like the movement of planets and stars. Anthropomorphic figures may depict deities, ancestors, or mythological beings whose stories were preserved in oral traditions that died with the civilizations that created them. The art suggests intellectual frameworks for understanding existence that were sophisticated enough to require specialized training and institutional structures for their preservation and transmission. The modern investigation of Malta's megalithic sites requires archaeological techniques that can reveal hidden features without damaging monuments that represent irreplaceable records of human achievement. Ground-penetrating radar reveals previously unknown chambers and passages that may connect temple complexes in ways that were not apparent from surface examination. Acoustic analysis of temple interiors documents sound properties that confirm the deliberate design of spaces for auditory effects. Chemical analysis of stone surfaces reveals traces of pigments that once decorated the monuments with colours that have faded beyond visibility, but that can still be detected through scientific instruments. The temples face preservation challenges that threaten their survival, despite having endured for nearly 6 millennia. Limestone is particularly vulnerable to acid rain and air pollution that can dissolve stone surfaces faster than natural weathering processes. Tourism pressure creates physical wear from millions of footsteps and poses risks of vandalism and accidental damage. Development pressure on the small islands threatens archaeological sites that may contain evidence of previously unknown temple complexes or associated settlements that could provide crucial information about the societies that built the monuments. The cultural significance of the temples extends beyond their archaeological importance to their role in contemporary Maltese identity and their recognition as World Heritage Sites that represent achievements of universal human value. The monuments appear on currency, stamps, and tourism materials as symbols of Malta's ancient heritage and contribution to world civilization. The temples have become points of national pride that connect modern Maltese citizens to ancestors who achieved something extraordinary despite the limitations of their time and technology. The limestone continues its slow transformation under Mediterranean sun and salt spray, its crystalline structure gradually changing as minerals migrate through microscopic pores in response to temperature fluctuations and chemical processes that operate on geological timescales. The temples are slowly returning to the earth from which they were carved, their massive blocks settling and shifting in ways that will eventually reduce them to rubble, unless active conservation efforts maintain their structural integrity. The monuments exist in a race between human preservation efforts and natural decay processes that have been operating since the day the last stone was set in place. The silence that fills the temple chambers today carries with it the echo of voices that once chanted in languages that have been forgotten for thousands of years. The spaces still possess the acoustic properties that their builders designed for ceremonies that combined architecture and sound and human community into experiences that transcended the ordinary world of daily survival. The temples wait in the Mediterranean sunshine like question marks carved from stone, their mysteries intact despite decades of archaeological investigation and scientific analysis. They stand as testimony to human creativity and ambition, and the eternal desire to build something that will outlast the brief span of individual lives, something that will carry forward into future generations the memory of peoples who dared to dream in stone and succeeded in making those dreams permanent features of the landscape where they lived and worked, and worshipped gods whose names are lost, but whose houses still welcome the sun each morning as they have for 60 centuries of Mediterranean dawns, in the river valleys of southeastern Europe, where the Danube and its tributaries wind through landscapes that seem pastoral and peaceful today. The copper gleams in archaeological layers that speak of civilizations more sophisticated than anything that would emerge in Europe for thousands of years to come. The Varna culture and its contemporaries scattered across the Balkans 7,000 years ago created the world's first metallurgical revolution, smelting copper from malachite ores, using techniques that required precise temperature control and alchemical knowledge that seems almost magical when considered against the Stone Age context in which it developed. The artifacts emerge from excavation sites like messages from a future that arrived too early, then vanished so completely that later Europeans would have to reinvent metallurgy from scratch. The grave goods buried with Copper Age chieftains staggers the imagination with their quantity and sophistication, suggesting levels of wealth accumulation and social stratification that rival those of later Bronze Age kingdoms. The Varna cemetery alone has yielded more gold artifacts than all other Copper Age sites in the world combined, with individual burials containing hundreds of gold objects that represent more precious metal than most medieval European nobles would possess. The copper axes and chisels and awls display manufacturing techniques that would not be surpassed until the development of industrial machinery, their surfaces polished to mirror brightness, and their edges sharp enough to cut wood with surgical precision. The settlements associated with these remarkable cemeteries reveal urban planning and architectural sophistication that challenges traditional models of Neolithic social organization. The towns spread across dozens of acres, with houses arranged in regular patterns that suggest central planning and social coordination on scales that were not supposed to exist before the development of state-level political systems. The buildings themselves show construction techniques that required specialized knowledge of materials and structural engineering, with foundations that have survived 7 millennia of Balkan weather and walls that were built to support multiple stories. The tell sites that preserve evidence of Copper Age civilization rise like artificial hills above the European landscape, their layered deposits documenting centuries of continuous occupation by communities that grew in size and complexity over time. Each stratum tells part of the story of societies that developed from simple farming villages into proto-urban centres, with populations that may have numbered in the thousands. The archaeological sequences show gradual technological advancement and social elaboration, with early phases dominated by stone tools giving way to increasingly sophisticated copper implements, and finally to bronze artifacts that mark the transition to the next phase of European prehistory. Yet the most puzzling aspect of the Copper Age achievement lies not in its sophistication, but in its apparent disappearance around 4000 BCE, when the brilliant metallurgical traditions and complex societies of southeastern Europe seem to have collapsed or been abandoned with a suddenness that has left archaeologists struggling for explanations. The tell sites show evidence of burning and abandonment, though whether this resulted from warfare, environmental catastrophe, or internal social breakdown remains unclear. The copper production centres fell silent, their techniques apparently lost so completely that later European societies had to rediscover metallurgy through contact with Near Eastern civilizations. The metallurgical workshops preserved in the archaeological record reveal industrial processes that seem impossibly advanced for their time period. The smelting furnaces show sophisticated understanding of oxidation and reduction chemistry, with designs that could achieve temperatures high enough to separate pure copper from complex ores. The casting techniques produced tools and weapons with precise dimensions and consistent quality, suggesting standardized production methods and quality control systems. The workshops processed ores that were imported from hundreds of miles away, indicating trade networks that connected distant mining regions with manufacturing centers in ways that foreshadowed later Bronze Age commercial systems. The social implications of advanced metallurgy in Copper Age Europe extend far beyond the simple production of better tools and weapons. The concentration of valuable metal objects in elite burials suggests the emergence of hereditary aristocracies with enough power to command the labour and resources necessary for large-scale mining and smelting operations. The standardization of metal products implies centralized production and distribution systems that required administrative capabilities and social institutions that could coordinate complex economic activities across multiple communities. The copper becomes evidence of social revolution as much as technological advancement. The irony of Europe's first Metal Age becomes apparent when its achievements are compared to the primitive stereotypes that popular culture associates with Neolithic peoples, while conventional narratives portray European prehistory as a slow progression from hunter-gatherers to simple farmers to Bronze Age civilizations. The archaeological reality shows a brilliant but brief flowering of metallurgical sophistication that preceded the Bronze Age by millennia, and that may have been more advanced than anything that followed until the Roman period. The Copper Age represents a road not taken, a developmental pathway that was abandoned for reasons that remain mysterious. The environmental records preserved in lake sediments and pollen cores from southeastern Europe document dramatic climate changes that may have contributed to the collapse of Copper Age civilizations. The period around 4000 BCE saw significant cooling and drying across much of Europe, with archaeological evidence for widespread abandonment of settlements and apparent population decline. The climate changes may have disrupted the agricultural systems that supported dense populations and complex societies, forcing people to return to simpler subsistence strategies that did not require the social coordination necessary for advanced metallurgy. The preservation of Copper Age sites depends on geological and archaeological conditions that vary dramatically across the Balkan region. Some tell sites have been continuously occupied since the Copper Age, with modern towns built directly on top of ancient settlements in ways that make archaeological investigation extremely difficult. Other sites have been abandoned since antiquity and preserve remarkably complete records of Copper Age life. But these sites are increasingly threatened by modern development and agricultural intensification that can destroy archaeological deposits that have survived for thousands of years. The copper ores that fueled Europe's first metallurgical revolution came from mining operations that show evidence of systematic exploitation and sophisticated extraction techniques. The mines penetrate hundreds of feet into mountainsides, following ore veins with precision that suggests detailed geological knowledge and long-term planning. The underground workings include ventilation systems, drainage channels, and support structures that allowed miners to work safely in conditions that would challenge modern mining engineers. The scale of the operations implies organized labor forces and management systems that coordinated the activities of hundreds of workers over extended periods. The trade networks that distributed Copper Age products across Europe reveal commercial relationships that operated on continental scales, with standardized weights and measures that suggest common economic institutions across multiple cultures and regions. Copper axes manufactured in the Balkans appear in archaeological sites from the Atlantic coast to the Russian steppes, indicating exchange networks that spanned thousands of miles and crossed multiple linguistic and cultural boundaries. The distribution patterns suggest not just occasional trade, but regular commercial relationships that operated for centuries with remarkable consistency. The artistic traditions associated with Copper Age societies show aesthetic sensibilities that rival those of much later civilizations, with decorative motifs and sculptural forms that demonstrate sophisticated understanding of proportion, symmetry, and visual composition. The pottery displays complex decorative schemes that may represent symbolic systems or early writing experiments. The metalwork includes purely ornamental objects that serve no utilitarian purpose, suggesting that Copper Age societies had progressed beyond mere subsistence to the point where they could devote resources to aesthetic expression and display of social status. The modern descendants of Copper Age peoples preserve oral traditions that may contain memories of the ancient metallurgical centers, passed down through generations of folk songs and stories that encode historical information in forms that can survive for thousands of years. Some Balkan traditions speak of golden ages when their ancestors possessed knowledge and wealth that were later lost, narratives that may preserve cultural memories of the Copper Age achievement. The traditions exist like archaeological deposits in human memory, their contents gradually revealed through careful analysis of their symbolic content and historical references. The wind still moves across the Balkan valleys, where the first European metalworkers learned to transform stone into copper, and copper into tools that would change human civilization forever. The tell sites rise from agricultural fields like monuments to forgotten genius, their stratified deposits holding the memory of societies that achieved something extraordinary and then vanish so completely that their existence was unknown, until modern archaeology began to excavate the layered evidence of their remarkable but brief moment in the sun of human achievement and technological innovation that blazed across prehistoric Europe like a meteor and then disappeared into the darkness of historical forgetting. Deep in the Amazon rainforest, where the canopy filters sunlight into green cathedral spaces, and the forest floor seems to stretch endlessly beneath towering trees that have grown for centuries in soil that outsiders dismissed as too poor to support complex civilization. The geometric earthworks emerge from cleared jungle like messages written in a language of ditches and embankments that speaks of sophisticated engineering knowledge and social organization among peoples who were supposed to be simple hunter-gatherers living in harmony with pristine nature. The geoglyphs spread across an area larger than Britain, their precise geometric forms visible only from aircraft that can see what ground-level observers miss evidence of one of the world's most extensive and least understood pre-Columbian civilizations. The earthworks take forms that seem to follow mathematical principles that archaeologists are still trying to decipher, with circles and squares and complex polygons that demonstrate understanding of geometry and surveying techniques that rival those of contemporary civilizations in other parts of the world. The largest structures span more than 1,000 feet in diameter, their ditches excavated to depths of several meters and their embankments rising high enough to be visible across the forest canopy when it existed. The precision of their construction suggests the use of standardized units of measurement and sophisticated planning techniques that required coordination between multiple work groups operating across vast areas of difficult terrain. The discovery of the Amazon geoglyphs revolutionizes understanding of pre-Columbian American civilizations, revealing evidence of complex societies in regions that European colonizers and their descendants assumed had been inhabited only by small bands of nomadic peoples living in scattered villages without permanent architecture or large-scale social organization. The earthworks require engineering knowledge, massive labor investment, and social coordination that could only have been achieved by civilizations with populations numbering in the hundreds of thousands, and political systems capable of organizing continent-scale construction projects that took generations to complete. The soil science behind the Amazon earthworks reveals agricultural techniques that seem to contradict everything that modern agronomists thought they knew about tropical farming in acidic, nutrient-poor soils that were supposed to be unsuitable for intensive cultivation. The terra preta sites scattered throughout the region show evidence of deliberate soil management that created anthropogenic soils with fertility levels that exceed those of the world's most productive agricultural regions. The black earth results from centuries of careful composting, charcoal addition, and waste management that transform naturally poor soils into agricultural resources that remain productive even today, centuries after their creators disappeared. The artifacts associated with the earthwork sites tell stories of technological sophistication and cultural complexity that challenge every assumption about the capabilities of Amazonian societies. Pottery fragments show artistic traditions and manufacturing techniques that required specialized knowledge and years of training to master. Stone tools display knapping techniques that produced implements sharper than surgical steel and more durable than modern alternatives. Wooden artifacts preserved in waterlogged deposits reveal carpentry skills and tool-making traditions that created functional and decorative objects of remarkable sophistication. Yet the greatest mystery of the Amazon geoglyphs lies not in their construction, but in their purpose, which remains as enigmatic as the civilizations that created them. The earthworks show no evidence of defensive features, suggesting that they were not fortifications designed to protect settlements from military attack. The lack of obvious residential areas within the enclosures indicates that they were not permanent towns or cities, but specialized structures designed for activities that left few archaeological traces. The geometric precision and astronomical alignments suggest ceremonial or religious functions, but the specific nature of the activities that took place within these massive earthen circles remains unknown. The environmental implications of the geoglyph discoveries extend far beyond archaeology to fundamental questions about the relationship between human societies and tropical forest ecosystems. The earthworks were built in areas that were assumed to be pristine wilderness, but the archaeological evidence reveals landscapes that had been extensively modified by human activity for thousands of years before European contact. The forest itself may be largely anthropogenic, its species composition and spatial distribution shaped by indigenous management practices that created what Europeans mistook for untouched nature. The irony of the Amazon earthworks becomes apparent when their scale and sophistication are compared to European assumptions about New World civilizations. While conquistadors and their chroniclers dismissed Amazonian peoples as primitive savages without permanent settlements or complex technologies, the archaeological evidence reveals engineering achievements that rival anything accomplished by contemporary European civilizations. The earthworks represent one of the world's largest construction projects, achieved by societies that left no written records, but whose achievements are literally written into the landscape they inhabited and transformed. The construction techniques revealed by archaeological investigation of the earthworks show evidence of sophisticated understanding of hydrology, soil mechanics, and landscape architecture that allowed the builders to create durable structures in environments that pose extreme challenges to any kind of construction project. The ditches include drainage systems that prevent waterlogging during seasonal floods while maintaining adequate moisture during dry periods. The embankments show evidence of soil compaction and stabilization techniques that have allowed them to survive centuries of tropical weather that destroys most human artifacts within decades of their creation. The dating of the Amazon earthworks pushes their origins back thousands of years into the pre-ceramic period, when the peoples of South America were supposed to be living in small, mobile bands without the social organization necessary for large-scale construction projects. Radiocarbon dates from organic materials associated with the earliest earthworks suggest that some sites may have been under construction before the development of pottery, metalworking, or agriculture in the Amazon basin. The chronology implies that monumental architecture in South America preceded the development of the technological and social innovations that archaeologists have traditionally considered prerequisites for complex civilization. The preservation of the Amazon geoglyphs depends on environmental conditions that are rapidly changing as deforestation, cattle ranching, and agricultural development alter the ecosystems that have protected these ancient sites for centuries. Many earthworks were discovered only when forest clearing exposed them to aerial observation, but the same activities that reveal their existence also threaten their preservation. The sites are disappearing faster than archaeologists can study them, their evidence erased by bulldozers and chainsaws that destroy in hours what took generations to create. The modern indigenous peoples of the Amazon preserve oral traditions that may contain memories of the earthwork builders, passed down through generations of storytelling that encode historical information in mythological narratives and ceremonial practices. Some groups speak of ancestors who possessed great power and knowledge, who could move earth and stone and create lasting monuments to their achievements. The traditions describe times when the forest was more open and the rivers ran differently, when large populations lived in permanent settlements connected by roads and waterways that facilitated trade and communication across vast distances. The scientific investigation of the Amazon earthworks requires interdisciplinary collaboration between archaeologists, soil scientists, botanists, climatologists, and other specialists who can contribute different types of evidence to the reconstruction of pre-Columbian Amazonian civilizations. The earthworks are not just archaeological sites, but complex ecological systems whose investigation reveals information about ancient environments, climate changes, and human-nature relationships that extends far beyond the immediate questions of who built these structures and why they were created. The geometric precision of the earthworks implies the existence of mathematical knowledge and surveying techniques that were transmitted through educational systems and institutional structures that could preserve and advance technical knowledge over multiple generations. The standardization of forms and proportions across hundreds of sites scattered over thousands of square miles suggests common design principles and shared cultural traditions that unified diverse communities in collective construction projects that required unprecedented levels of cooperation and coordination. The earthworks continue to emerge from the forest as satellite imagery and aerial surveys reveal previously unknown sites scattered throughout the Amazon basin, their geometric forms becoming visible as the canopy opens, and the low-angle light of dawn and dusk creates shadows that highlight subtle topographic features invisible to ground-level observation. Each new discovery adds pieces to the puzzle of Amazonian prehistory, revealing evidence of civilizations that were far more complex and extensive than anyone imagined possible in environments that were supposed to be marginal for human habitation and unsuitable for the development of complex societies. The forest grows back over the earthworks with remarkable speed when human activity ceases, its aggressive vegetation quickly obscuring the geometric forms that took generations to create and maintain. The jungle becomes both preserver and destroyer of these ancient monuments, protecting them from human interference while simultaneously erasing the evidence of their existence through the relentless growth of trees and vines and undergrowth that can reduce the most massive earthworks to barely visible depressions in the forest floor within decades of abandonment. The wind moves through the canopy above the hidden earthworks, carrying with it the seeds and pollen of plants that have grown in soil enriched by human activity for thousands of years. The forest itself becomes an archaeological artifact, its species composition and ecosystem structure shaped by indigenous management practices that created landscapes of remarkable productivity and diversity that Europeans mistook for wilderness, but that were actually elaborate gardens tended by civilizations whose achievements are only now beginning to be recognized and appreciated by a world that is finally learning to see the Amazon as something more than empty green space waiting to be developed. Across the windswept steppes of Mongolia, where the grasslands stretch toward horizons that seem to merge sky and earth in shimmering lines of infinite distance. The deerstone stand like ancient sentinels marking territories and commemorating events that have passed beyond the reach of written history into the realm of carved stone and archaeological speculation. The megaliths rise from the steppe in clusters and alignments that follow patterns invisible to casual observation, but clear to those who understand the astronomical knowledge and ceremonial traditions of nomadic peoples who lived by the rhythms of stars and seasons and the great migrations of animals that moved like rivers of life across the Eurasian heartland. The stones themselves bear carvings that seem to dance with stylized energy, despite being frozen in granite for 3,000 years. Their surfaces covered with images of deer that leap and bound across vertical landscapes of abstract symbols and geometric patterns. The deer appear to be flying rather than running, their antlers transformed into elaborate branching forms that could represent trees or rivers or the neural networks of consciousness itself. The artistic style suggests movement and transformation, as if the stone carvers were attempting to capture not just the physical appearance of the animals, but their spiritual essence and their role in cosmological systems that connected earth and sky through the medium of migrating herds. The distribution of deer stones across the Mongolian landscape reveals patterns that suggest sophisticated understanding of astronomical cycles and their relationship to the seasonal movements of both animals and human communities that followed them across thousands of miles of grassland. The megaliths often mark locations with clear views of the horizon, allowing observation of the rising and setting of celestial bodies that served as calendars for peoples who lived by the rhythms of natural cycles rather than mechanical time. The orientations of stone alignments correspond to solar and lunar events that marked important moments in the annual round of nomadic life. The burial complexes associated with the deer stones tell stories of social stratification and ritual elaboration that challenge stereotypes about nomadic societies as consisting of egalitarian bands without complex religious institutions or permanent monuments. The kurgans that cluster around the megaliths contain grave goods that rival those found in contemporary sedentary civilizations, with gold ornaments, bronze weapons, and textiles that demonstrate advanced metalworking and weaving techniques. The size and contents of the burials suggest hereditary elites who commanded resources and labor on scales that required sophisticated political organizations. Yet the most profound mystery of the Deerstone tradition lies in its combination of nomadic mobility with monumental permanence, creating landscapes of memory that connected mobile peoples to fixed points of reference across the vast spaces of the steppe. The stones served as landmarks in territories where few natural features provided reliable navigation points, but they also functioned as ritual centers where scattered communities could gather for ceremonies that reinforced social bonds and cultural identity. The megaliths represent solutions to the challenge of maintaining cultural continuity among peoples whose survival depended on movement and adaptation to changing environmental conditions. The astronomical alignments built into the Deerstone complexes reveal knowledge of celestial mechanics that seems remarkably sophisticated for societies that left no written records of their observations and calculations. The stone arrangements mark not just obvious events like solstices and equinoxes, but more subtle phenomena like lunar standstills and planetary conjunctions that require systematic observation over multiple generations to detect and predict. The knowledge embedded in the monuments suggests educational institutions and intellectual traditions that could preserve and transmit complex technical information through oral rather than written means. The irony of the Deerstone tradition becomes apparent when its achievements are compared to the dismissive attitudes that sedentary civilizations have historically displayed toward nomadic peoples. While Chinese chronicles and Persian histories portray steppe societies as barbaric raiders without culture or learning, the archaeological evidence reveals civilizations that created some of the world's most sophisticated astronomical monuments and that developed technologies and social institutions perfectly adapted to their environments. The Deerstones represent intellectual achievements that rival those of contemporary sedentary civilizations, but that remained invisible to outside observers who could not understand the logic of nomadic life. The preservation of Deerstones depends on the harsh climate conditions of the Mongolian steppe, where extreme temperature variations and low precipitation create environments that protect stone monuments from the weathering processes that destroy similar artifacts in more temperate regions. The dry air and intense solar radiation sterilize the stone surfaces, preventing the growth of lichens and mosses that can cause chemical weathering. The sparse vegetation provides little root pressure that could crack or displace the megaliths. The remote locations protect the stones from human interference and vandalism. The carving techniques revealed by detailed analysis of the Deerstone surfaces show evidence of sophisticated stoneworking traditions that required specialized tools and years of training to master. The artists used bronze and iron implements to cut designs into granite surfaces with precision that rivals modern stone-cutting techniques. The depth and consistency of the carving suggests standardized methods and quality control that indicate craft specialization, and possibly guild systems that maintain technical standards across multiple generations of stoneworkers. The cultural significance of deer in steppe societies extends far beyond their economic importance as sources of meat, hides, and bone tools to their role in mythological systems that explain the relationship between human consciousness and natural cycles. The deer appear in shamanistic traditions as psychopomps that guide souls between the world of the living and the realm of the ancestors, their seasonal migrations serving as metaphors for the cyclical nature of death and rebirth. The antlers that crown the carved deer may represent not just physical ornaments, but symbolic connections between earth-based life and sky-based spiritual forces. The modern descendants of the peoples who created the deerstone tradition preserve nomadic lifestyles and cultural practices that may contain echoes of ancient ceremonial traditions associated with the megaliths. Contemporary Mongolian herders still follow seasonal migration patterns that bring them near many deerstone sites, and some groups maintain oral traditions that speak of the stones as marking places where ancestors performed rituals that ensured the prosperity of both human communities and animal herds. The tradition suggests that the megaliths continue to function as sacred sites in contemporary nomadic cosmology. The archaeological investigation of deerstone sites requires techniques adapted to the unique challenges of working in steppe environments, where preservation conditions vary dramatically, and where modern nomadic land use can disturb archaeological contexts in ways that are difficult to detect. The sites often appear as subtle variations in surface topography that become visible only under specific lighting conditions or during certain seasons when vegetation patterns highlight buried features. Ground-penetrating radar and other non-invasive techniques allow researchers to map subsurface features without excavation that could damage fragile archaeological deposits. The dating of deerstone construction proves challenging due to the scarcity of organic materials that can provide radiocarbon dates and the difficulty of establishing secure archaeological context for stone monuments that may have been modified or relocated multiple times during their use lives. The stylistic analysis of carved motifs provides relative chronologies that suggest the tradition persisted for over 1,000 years, with early phases characterized by simpler designs, giving way to increasingly elaborate iconographic programs that may reflect changes in religious beliefs or social organization among steppe societies. The geographic distribution of deerstones reveals cultural connections that spanned thousands of miles of Eurasian steppe, with similar monument types appearing from Mongolia to the Black Sea region, and stylistic influences that suggest contact between nomadic groups separated by vast distances. The cultural unity implied by these connections challenges models of nomadic society that emphasize isolation and cultural fragmentation, suggesting instead that steppe peoples maintained communication networks and shared traditions that created cultural coherence across continental scales. The ceremonial landscapes associated with deerstone complexes include not just the megaliths themselves, but also associated features like stone circles, burial mounds, and sacrificial sites that together created ritual environments where multiple activities could take place simultaneously or in sequence during seasonal gatherings. The landscape archaeology of these sites reveals sophisticated understanding of spatial relationships and ceremonial choreography that transformed natural settings into sacred theatres, where communities could enact rituals that reinforced cultural identity and cosmological understanding. The wind continues its endless movement across the Mongolian steppes, carrying with it the whispered conversations of people who understood that permanence and mobility were not contradictory concepts, but complementary aspects of existence, that required both fixed reference points and the freedom to move between them according to the rhythms of natural cycles and spiritual obligations. The deer stones wait in the grassland like ancient computers programmed with astronomical data and cultural information that their creators encoded in granite and geometric form, their carved surfaces holding conversations with the stars that began 3,000 years ago and continue every clear night when the constellations wheel overhead, in patterns that nomadic astronomers mapped and measured and built into monuments that honor both the precision of celestial mechanics and the wild freedom of deer that leap across steppes and stone and time itself. On the islands of Japan, where volcanic mountains rise from seas that have witnessed the birth of civilizations and the patient accumulation of cultural traditions that stretch back to the dawn of human creativity. The Jomon pottery emerges from archaeological sites like evidence of humanity's first experiments with transforming earth into art through the alchemy of fire and clay. The cord-marked ceramics that give the culture its name appear in layers that date back 16,000 years, making them among the world's oldest known pottery traditions and challenging every assumption about the relationship between sedentary life, agriculture, and the development of ceramic technology among peoples who remained hunter-gatherers for millennia while creating some of the most sophisticated and beautiful pottery ever produced by human hands. The pottery itself defies easy categorization, with forms that range from simple utilitarian vessels to elaborate sculptural creations that seem to exist primarily for aesthetic rather than practical purposes. The surfaces bear impressions made by rolling twisted cords across wet clay, creating textural patterns that vary from simple geometric designs to complex compositions that suggest symbolic meaning and artistic traditions passed down through generations of potters who refine their techniques over thousands of years. The decorative schemes show regional variations and chronological changes that allow archaeologists to trace cultural development and population movements across the Japanese archipelago over extraordinary spans of time. The Jomon settlements reveal evidence of permanent villages and sophisticated social organization among peoples who lived entirely by hunting, fishing, and gathering wild resources without ever developing agriculture or animal domestication. The sites contain substantial wooden structures, elaborate storage facilities, and communal areas that suggest year-round occupation by communities that numbered in the hundreds. The settlements cluster around coastal areas and riverine locations where seasonal salmon runs and shellfish beds provided reliable protein sources that could support dense populations without the need for farming or herding that characterized contemporary societies in other parts of the world. The archaeological deposits at Jomon sites preserve organic materials that provide unprecedented insights into the daily lives and environmental relationships of hunter-gatherer peoples who achieved levels of cultural complexity that were not supposed to be possible without agricultural surplus and the social stratification that farming typically produces. Wooden tools retain their original shapes and surface textures after thousands of years of burial in waterlogged conditions. Plant remains reveal detailed information about seasonal subsistence strategies and the management of wild resources through controlled burning, selective harvesting, and other techniques that enhance the productivity of natural ecosystems without fundamentally altering them. Yet the most remarkable aspect of Jomon culture lies not in its longevity or its technical achievements, but in its apparent stability and sustainability over time periods that dwarf the entire span of recorded human history. The same basic cultural patterns persisted for over 10,000 years, with pottery styles and settlement patterns and subsistence strategies showing gradual evolution rather than the dramatic transformations that characterized contemporary societies in other regions. The Jomon achieved a form of sustainable development that allowed them to maintain complex hunter-gatherer lifestyles for longer than any other known human society. The pottery production techniques revealed by experimental archaeology and microscopic analysis of ancient sherds show evidence of sophisticated understanding of clay chemistry, firing temperatures, and decorative methods that required specialized knowledge and years of training to master. The potters learned to select specific clay sources and to add tempering materials that would prevent cracking during the drying and firing processes. They developed glazing techniques using natural materials and achieved firing temperatures that required carefully controlled combustion in kilns that were architectural achievements in their own right. The irony of Jomon cultural achievement becomes apparent when their accomplishments are compared to the evolutionary models that dominate archaeological theory about human social development. The Jomon created permanent settlements, sophisticated technologies, and complex art traditions without agriculture, developed elaborate pottery without metal tools, and maintained stable societies without apparent social hierarchies or centralized political authority. They represent an alternative pathway of cultural development that suggests that complexity and sustainability are not necessarily contradictory goals in human social organization. The regional variations in Jomon pottery styles reveal cultural diversity and artistic innovation that flourished within the overall stability of the hunter-gatherer adaptation. Different areas develop distinctive decorative traditions, vessel forms, and manufacturing techniques that reflect local environmental conditions, resource availability, and cultural preferences. The diversity suggests that Jomon society was not monolithic, but consisted of numerous local communities that maintained their own artistic traditions, while participating in broader cultural patterns that unified the archipelago. The preservation of Jomon sites depends on specific environmental conditions that exist in only certain parts of Japan, where acidic soils and waterlogged deposits protect organic materials from decay, while dry shell middens preserve ceramic assemblages in excellent condition. Many of the most important sites are located in areas that are now experiencing rapid urban development, creating urgent conservation challenges for archaeologists who are racing to excavate and document cultural deposits before they are destroyed by construction projects and industrial development. The subsistence strategies revealed by analysis of Jomon archaeological deposits show evidence of resource management techniques that enhance the productivity of natural environments without causing ecological degradation or resource depletion. The hunter-gatherers used controlled burning to maintain oak forests that produced abundant acorn crops, selectively harvested shellfish to maintain sustainable population levels, and developed seasonal scheduling that maximized resource extraction while allowing for natural regeneration. The techniques represent sophisticated environmental knowledge that contemporary resource managers are only beginning to understand and appreciate. The dating of Jomon pottery development pushes the origins of ceramic technology back thousands of years earlier than was previously thought possible, suggesting that pottery was invented independently in multiple locations around the world, and that its development was not necessarily connected to agricultural transitions or sedentary lifestyles. The early appearance of ceramics in Japan challenges models that link pottery production to food storage needs associated with farming, and suggests that the technology may have been developed for symbolic or artistic, rather than purely utilitarian purposes. The artistic traditions expressed in Jomon pottery reveal aesthetic sensibilities and symbolic systems that operated according to principles that modern observers can appreciate but not fully understand. The decorative motifs show recurring patterns that may represent cosmological concepts, seasonal cycles, or mythological narratives that were encoded in clay and fired into permanent form. The pottery becomes a form of writing without words, a visual language that preserves cultural information in forms that can survive for thousands of years, even when the spoken languages and oral traditions that created them have been forgotten. The modern descendants of Jomon peoples preserve cultural practices and artistic traditions that may contain echoes of ancient techniques and symbolic systems, passed down through generations of craftspeople who maintain traditional knowledge even as Japanese society underwent dramatic transformations during historical periods. Contemporary Japanese pottery traditions show stylistic and technical elements that can be traced back through archaeological sequences to Jomon origins, creating unbroken chains of cultural transmission that span over 10,000 years of continuous development. The experimental recreation of Jomon pottery techniques by contemporary archaeologists and artists reveals the high levels of skill and knowledge required to produce ceramics using only natural materials and traditional firing methods. The experiments show that successful pottery production requires intimate understanding of local clay sources, seasonal timing of collection and preparation activities, and precise control of firing conditions that can only be achieved through years of practice and careful attention to variables that affect every stage of the manufacturing process. The social organization implied by Jomon pottery production suggests craft specialization and knowledge transmission systems that operated without the formal institutions and hierarchical structures that characterize ceramic traditions in agricultural societies. The potters appear to have been integrated members of hunter-gatherer communities rather than full-time specialists, yet they achieved levels of technical and artistic sophistication that rival the work of professional craftspeople in more complex societies. The achievement suggests alternative forms of social organization that could support high-quality artistic production within egalitarian community structures. The ceramic assemblages from different Jomon periods reveal changing aesthetic preferences and technical innovations that reflect cultural evolution over timescales that dwarf the development of historical civilizations. The earliest pottery shows relatively simple forms and decorative schemes that gradually give way to increasingly elaborate vessels with complex sculptural elements and surface treatments. The evolution suggests artistic traditions that could maintain creative vitality and innovation over thousands of years, while remaining within the overall framework of hunter-gatherer social organization. The fire still burns in contemporary Japanese pottery kilns, its flames carrying forward the ancient dialogue between earth and water and air that Jomon potters began 16,000 years ago, when they first discovered that clay could be transformed through heat into objects of beauty and utility that would outlast their makers by millennia. The cord-marked surfaces continue to inspire modern artists who recognize in the ancient patterns an aesthetic wisdom that connects human creativity to natural processes and seasonal rhythms that operate on scales both daily and geological. Their impressed textures holding conversations between past and present that speak in the universal language of clay and fire, and the patient hands that shape both earth and time into forms that celebrate the endless human capacity to find beauty in the simplest materials and to make permanent the fleeting moments of inspiration that transform survival into art. In the silence that settles over archaeological sites when the excavators have packed away their tools and the tourists have departed, and the night sky merges with its ancient patterns of stars that witness the rise and fall of civilizations whose names are lost to time. The earth holds its secrets with the patience of geological ages and the quiet dignity of stones that remember when they were mountains before they became the foundations of temples and the walls of cities that flourished briefly in the endless conversation between human ambition and the forces that shape continents, the forgotten peoples rest beneath layers of sediment and forgetting. Their achievements dissolved into the anonymous democracy of deep time, where all human endeavours become equal in their silence and their slow return to the elements from which they emerged. The civilizations that archaeology has not yet discovered outnumber those that have been excavated and catalogued and displayed in museums, their existence hinted at by anomalous artifacts and genetic patterns and linguistic reconstructions that suggest human stories more complex and varied than the incomplete narratives that textbooks preserve. Beneath the Amazon rainforest and the Sahara Desert, and the continental shelves flooded by rising seas, beneath the urban centres built on the accumulated debris of previous settlements, and the agricultural fields ploughed for millennia over the ruins of forgotten towns. The archaeological record extends like an iceberg whose visible portion represents only the smallest fraction of human achievement across the vast spans of prehistory and history that preceded the invention of writing systems that could preserve names and dates, and the linear chronicles that later civilizations would mistake for the totality of human experience. The pottery sherds and stone tools and fragments of bone that emerge from excavation contexts speak of daily lives lived with the same intensity and hope and fear that characterize contemporary human existence. But they speak in languages that require archaeological translation and statistical analysis and radiocarbon dating to render their messages comprehensible to minds trained in different traditions of meaning-making. The artifacts become hieroglyphs in a script written by time itself, their significance emerging only through the patient accumulation of evidence that allows researchers to reconstruct the social worlds and environmental relationships and technological achievements of peoples who solve the fundamental problems of human existence using methods and materials and social organizations that represented alternative possibilities for cultural development. These sites themselves wait in landscapes that have been transformed by centuries or millennia of subsequent human activity and natural processes that bury and preserve and sometimes destroy the evidence of past habitation with equal indifference to the historical significance of what lies beneath the surface. The tell sites of the Middle East rise like artificial hills above plains where modern cities sprawl across the irrigation systems that ancient engineers carved into alluvial soils that still hold the memory of the first experiments with urban planning and centralized government. The shell middens of coastal regions preserve the chemical signatures of ancient diets in calcium carbonate deposits that record the seasonal rhythms of gathering and feasting that sustained maritime peoples for thousands of years before agriculture transformed human relationships with natural abundance. Yet the most profound mystery of lost civilizations lies not in their material achievements, but in their consciousness and worldviews, and the ways they understood their place in the universe and their relationships with each other, and with the natural forces that shape their environments and their possibilities. The archaeological record preserves the results of human actions, but not the thoughts and beliefs and emotional experiences that motivated those actions, leaving researchers to infer the inner lives of ancient peoples from the external evidence of their behavior and the patterns that statistical analysis can detect in the distribution of artifacts across space and time. The oral traditions that survive among indigenous communities around the world preserve fragments of historical memory that extend back far beyond the reach of written documentation, their narratives encoding information about environmental changes and population movements and cultural innovations in mythological forms that can transmit accurate historical data across dozens of generations of storytelling. The stories speak of floods and droughts and wars and migrations that may correspond to actual events recorded in the geological and archaeological records. But they speak in symbolic languages that require careful interpretation to separate historical kernels from mythological elaborations that accumulated around original events like sediment, depositing around artifacts in archaeological sites. The irony of lost civilizations lies in their simultaneous visibility and invisibility, their traces scattered across landscapes that millions of people traverse daily without recognizing the evidence of human achievement that lies beneath their feet, or the significance of the landforms and vegetation patterns that preserve the signatures of ancient environmental management and social organization. The earthworks become features of modern topography. The ancient roads become property boundaries in contemporary legal systems. The irrigation channels become elements in modern drainage networks that continue to function according to engineering principles that their original designers understood but that their contemporary users have forgotten. The preservation of archaeological evidence depends on the continuation of environmental conditions that protected sites for centuries or millennia, but that can change rapidly in response to climate change and development pressure, and alterations in land use that expose previously protected deposits to destructive processes. The rising sea levels that threaten contemporary coastal cities also threaten underwater archaeological sites that preserve evidence of Ice Age civilizations, while the melting permafrost that concerns climate scientists also threatens the organic artifacts and environmental records that document human adaptation to previous episodes of global warming and cooling. The modern technologies that allow archaeologists to detect and investigate sites without excavation also reveal the vast extent of human modification of landscapes that appeared natural to earlier observers, showing that indigenous peoples shaped the environments that Europeans encountered through fire management and species selection, and earth moving that created anthropogenic landscapes on continental scales. The technologies that make these discoveries possible also make possible the destruction of sites at unprecedented rates, as remote sensing that reveals archaeological features to researchers also reveals them to looters and developers who can destroy in hours what took generations to create and millennia to preserve. The forgotten civilizations continue their patient dissolution into the materials from which they were built, their organic components returning to soil and their mineral components weathering back into sediment that will become the raw materials for future geological processes. The cities become hills, the temples become quarries for later builders, the irrigation systems become features in modern hydrological networks. The roads become pathways that contemporary peoples follow without knowing the antiquity of the routes they travel, or the destinations toward which their ancient predecessors were walking when they wore those paths into the landscape. The artifacts that museums preserve represent only the tiniest fraction of the material culture that these lost civilizations produced, biased toward items made from durable materials and discovered in contexts that favored preservation and recovery by archaeological investigation. The wooden objects and textiles and foods and medicines and all the perishable products of human creativity have mostly returned to the earth, leaving behind only the traces of their existence in the form of impressions in clay and stains in soil and the occasional organic fragments that survived in exceptional preservation environments. The languages that these peoples spoke and the songs they sang and the stories they told around fires that warmed them during long winter nights have mostly vanished without trace, though comparative linguistics sometimes detects their influence in the vocabularies and grammatical structures of descendant languages that evolved from ancient roots. The knowledge systems that allowed them to navigate by stars and predict weather patterns and manage complex ecosystems may survive in fragments among contemporary indigenous communities, but much of their accumulated wisdom about living sustainably in specific environments has been lost to the cultural disruptions that accompanied colonization and modernization. The silence deepens as the night advances and the archaeological sites rest under stars that wheel overhead in the same patterns that guided ancient navigators across oceans and continents to new lands where they would establish settlements that would grow into civilizations that would flourish and decline and be forgotten in their turn. The earth holds all these stories in its patient embrace, preserving what it can of human achievement while allowing the rest to return to the elements that compose both planets and people in the endless cycles that connect individual lives to cosmic processes that operate on scales beyond human comprehension, but within human experience for those who know how to read the signatures that time leaves in stone and bone and the archaeological record that extends like memory itself into the deepest past and the farthest future, where other archaeologists will puzzle over the remains of contemporary civilization and wonder what we believed and hoped for and how we understood our place in the universe that holds us all. The wind moves across all these forgotten landscapes with the same patience it has carried for millions of years, stirring dust that may contain the powdered remains of pottery fired by hands that new techniques lost to time, lifting pollen from plants whose ancestors were cultivated by peoples whose agricultural wisdom dissolved back into the wild genetics of their domesticated species. The air carries these particles across continents and oceans, mixing the molecular remnants of vanished civilizations with the breath of contemporary cities and the exhaled dreams of sleeping children who will grow up in a world where the past rests beneath their feet like a vast library written in languages that few can read. The archaeological sites settle into their evening quiet, their exposed stone walls cooling under stars that have watched the entire span of human cultural development, from the first fires kindled in African caves to the electric lights that now illuminate cities built on the accumulated ruins of hundreds of previous settlements. The excavation grids wait under protective tarps for tomorrow's careful brushwork to reveal another few centimeters of human time, another handful of artifacts that will add microscopic precision to the growing understanding of how our ancestors solved the eternal problems of survival and meaning, and the creation of beauty in a universe that seems indifferent to individual longing, but that somehow produced consciousness capable of recognizing its own place in the cosmic story. The forgotten civilizations rest in their silence, not truly lost but only temporarily misplaced in the vast archive of sedimentary time that preserves everything and reveals it slowly, grain by grain, to those patient enough to sift through millennia of accumulated earth with brushes fine enough to detect the boundary between human intention and natural process. They wait there in the darkness between archaeological seasons, these ancient peoples who were once as alive and hopeful and frightened as anyone has ever been, their stories held in trust by the soil that covers them and the artifacts that will outlast all the empires that have risen since their time. The earth keeps faith with all of them. These builders of the first temples and weavers of the first cloth and potters who discovered fire's power to transform clay into permanence, holding their achievements safe in the democracy of deep time, where all human accomplishments become equal in their antiquity and their patient wait for rediscovery. In this vast museum without walls, every handful of earth potentially holds fragments of human genius, and every hillock may be a tell site where civilizations dreamed themselves into existence and then allowed themselves to be forgotten, trusting to time and chance and the curiosity of future archaeologists to remember them back into the human story that continues across all the years that separate their world from ours. The night deepens over the sites where they rest. These ancestors who gave us everything we have and are, their legacy written not in monuments that proclaim their names, but in the genetic code and cultural inheritance, and accumulated knowledge that flows through contemporary human civilization, like an underground river connecting all times and all places in the endless conversation between past and present that creates the future with every breath and every heartbeat and every moment of recognition, that we are all part of something larger and older and more patient than any individual life, but dependent on individual lives for its continuation and its slow revelation of the possibilities that consciousness creates when it encounters a universe vast enough to hold all the dreams that human beings have ever dreamed.